I handed my boss my resignation at 52, expecting a handshake for 25 years of blood and sweat. Instead, the boy laughed in my face, told me I was walking away with nothing, and threw my letter in the trash. I walked out of that building in silence, thinking I had lost it all. I had no idea that days later, his biggest client, the man holding the keys to his entire empire, would walk into his boardroom, tear up $1 million contract, and demand to work exclusively with me. My name is Jerome Hayes. I am 52 years old, an African-American man who spent the last 2.5 decades pouring my absolute soul into building a commercial insurance firm from the ground up. Over the years, I clawed my way up the corporate ladder, surviving mergers, market crashes, and endless nights, eventually rising to the position of senior director. If you are listening to this and you believe that giving your absolute everything to your employer and your family guarantees you respect and comfort in your golden years, I need you to take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a harsh, brutal reality. It shows just how quickly the people you bleed for will dig your grave the very moment they decide you are no longer useful to their greedy agendas. The morning the nightmare began, the sky over the city was a heavy, suffocating shade of gray. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage of our sleek corporate headquarters, staring blankly at the leather steering wheel. My chest was incredibly tight. It was a heavy, burning pressure radiating down my left arm, a sensation that had become my terrifying and constant companion over the last few months. Stress-induced hypertension, my cardiologist had called it. He had sat me down just 2 days prior, looking at my test results with a grim, uncompromising expression. He told me my heart was a ticking time bomb. He warned me that if I did not step away from the relentless, soul-crushing pressure of my corporate job immediately, I was going to drop dead before my next birthday. That diagnosis was a massive wake-up call. For 25 years, I had completely sacrificed my physical body, my peace of mind, and my vibrant youth for this career. In the commercial insurance industry, you do not work regular hours. I spent my life taking red-eye flights across the country, eating stale airport food at 2 a.m, and negotiating massive complex contracts in stuffy hotel conference rooms, while other men were at home having warm, peaceful dinners with their families. I missed anniversaries. I missed holidays. I worked through violent fevers and deep exhaustion, because as an African-American man from humble beginnings, I always believed my absolute value was tied to my ability to provide, protect, and outwork everyone else in the room. I did it all for my wife, Cynthia. She was a beautiful white woman who I thought was my ultimate reward for all the struggles I endured. I wanted to give her the absolute world. I bought her the beautiful, sprawling suburban home she had always pointed at in those glossy luxury lifestyle magazines. I funded her extravagant tastes without question, purchasing the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and booking the expensive European vacations she loved to show off to her friends. My devotion did not stop with her. I extended that exact same loyalty to her family. I even paid off the massive law school loans for her younger brother, Greg. Greg was a man who always had a profound knack for finding trouble and avoiding hard, honest work. He lived rent-free in our basement for years, while he stumbled through his classes and failed his bar exams multiple times. I took care of Cynthia's family as if they were my own flesh and blood, asking for absolutely nothing in return but peace and loyalty. I never complained about the financial strain. I simply put my head down and worked even harder, taking on more clients and more stress, believing that my sacrifices were building an unbreakable foundation of love. I thought that when the time finally came for me to rest my tired bones, my wife and my home would be my ultimate sanctuary. With that comforting thought anchoring my racing heart, I turned off the engine, grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, and walked into the sleek, modern glass building. Walking through those sliding doors, I remembered when this company was nothing but 3 cheap rented desks in a dusty suburban strip mall. I had built this agency alongside the original founder, a tough but fair man who valued loyalty and recognized my talent when no one else would give me a chance. But he had passed away 2 years ago, leaving the entire thriving empire to his only son, Bradley. Bradley was 32 years old, arrogant, intensely entitled, and completely out of touch with the reality of hard work. He drove European sports cars that I essentially paid for through my commissions. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than some of our junior employees made in a month. And he spent most of his time playing golf or taking long drunken lunches at private country clubs. He did not know how to build a business. He only knew how to spend the vast amounts of money it generated. I walked past the long rows of cubicles, listening to the familiar hum of the office. The younger employees nodded at me with genuine respect as I passed. They knew I was the engine that kept the firm running. I handled the largest, most difficult accounts, including the firm's absolute crown jewel, the Harrison account. Mr. Harrison was a notoriously reclusive, old-school billionaire whose massive commercial properties generated enough commissions to keep our entire agency afloat during lean times. I had built that vital relationship from the ground up, earning his absolute trust over a decade of flawless, dedicated service. Without my meticulous risk models, the Harrison account would have left years ago. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite and stepped inside without knocking. Bradley was sitting behind his massive polished desk, his feet casually propped up on the wood, scrolling through social media on his phone. He did not even bother to look up or acknowledge my presence when I entered the room. "Good morning, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, despite the familiar dangerous burning sensation tightening in my chest. "We need to talk." "Make it quick, Jerome," he replied, his tone dripping with bored condescension. He still did not take his eyes off his glowing screen. "I have a tea time at 11, and I am already running behind schedule." I walked straight up to his desk and pulled a crisp white envelope from the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I set it down gently, directly in the center of his desk. I took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of 25 years resting entirely on this single defining moment. "I am handing in my resignation," I said. That finally got his attention. Bradley slowly lowered his phone and stared at the white envelope, then looked up at me. His expression quickly morphed into a nasty mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, dropping his feet to the floor. "We are closing the massive Harrison renewal this Friday. You absolutely cannot leave right before the biggest deal of the entire fiscal year." "It is not a joke," I told him, keeping my posture straight and my hands folded in front of me. "My health is failing, Bradley. My doctor has made it abundantly clear that the extreme stress of this position is literally killing me. My blood pressure is dangerously high. I have given this company my youth, my energy, and my unwavering loyalty for 2.5 decades. I helped your father build this place from absolutely nothing. I personally secured the millions of dollars that keep these fancy lights on. But I cannot do it anymore. I need to step down to save my own life. I need to go home, focus on my wife Cynthia, and actually enjoy the time I have left on this earth." I stood there foolishly expecting a moment of realization to wash over him. I expected him to remember the countless times I covered for his lazy mistakes, the nights I stayed awake fixing the financial models he ruined. Or at the very least, I expected a basic level of human decency. I expected him to offer a firm handshake, a sincere thank you, or perhaps even discuss a severance package to honor my decades of monumental service to his family's wealth. Instead, Bradley picked up the envelope. He did not even bother to open it to read the respectful words I had written inside. He just held it between his fingers, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed painfully off the cold glass walls of the executive office. "Save your life," he sneered, tossing my resignation letter carelessly into the metal trash can beside his desk. "You are 52 years old, Jerome. You are a dinosaur in a young man's game. Do you really think anyone else out there wants to hire a sick, tired old man? Good luck finding another job at your age." I stared at him, my jaw locked tight. The blatant disrespect was a physical blow to my gut, but I absolutely refused to let him see me bleed. "I am not looking for another job," I said quietly, refusing to break eye contact. "I am looking to retire with the dignity I have earned. I expect my unvested shares to be honored as per the original handshake agreement I made with your father years ago." Bradley laughed again, much louder this time. He leaned forward, planting his elbows aggressively on the desk, a nasty, victorious smirk spreading across his privileged face. "My father is dead, Jerome, and so are those ancient handshake agreements. If you quit, you forfeit every single unvested share you have. You walk away with absolutely nothing. No bonus, no payout, no golden parachute. You leave this building today, and you instantly cease to exist to this company. You are throwing away your entire financial future because you cannot handle a little corporate stress. You are pathetic." The vicious words hung heavily in the air, toxic and thick. The burning in my chest intensified a sharp, painful reminder of exactly why I was doing this. I could have shouted. I could have leaned over that desk, grabbed him by his expensive silk tie, and reminded him that without my intellect, without my sleepless nights, and without my industry relationships, his luxury sports cars would be repossessed in a month. I could have torn him apart with the righteous indignation of a man who had built the very floor he stood on. But I am a man who has learned the profound power of absolute silence. Arguing with a fool only proves there are two fools in the room. I looked at this arrogant, ungrateful boy, and I realized that my profound loyalty had been entirely wasted on him. He did not see my humanity. He did not see my sacrifice. He only saw a tool that had suddenly stopped generating him free money. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him the deep satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I simply looked him dead in the eye for a long, heavy, silent moment. The smirk on his face faltered just a fraction as the crushing weight of my silence pressed down on him. "I will clear out my desk," I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely detached. I turned on my heel and walked out of his office. I did not look back. I walked through the long corridors of the company I had built past the glass walls, and the busy employees feeling a strange, chaotic mixture of profound loss and sudden, undeniable liberation. 25 years of my life discarded into a metal trash can by an arrogant boy who had never worked a hard day in his entire life. As I packed my personal belongings into a small cardboard box, taking down the framed photos of Cynthia and my awards, I felt the familiar bitter sting of betrayal. It hurt to be discarded so easily. It hurt to realize that the millions I had earned for that company meant absolutely nothing in the end. But as I rode the elevator down to the concrete parking garage, I forced myself to focus on the one thing that kept me grounded. I still had my family. I still had my beautiful wife, Cynthia. I still had the gorgeous suburban home I had worked so incredibly hard to pay off. I told myself over and over that the corporate money did not matter as long as I had my health and my domestic sanctuary. I had enough personal savings to keep us comfortable for a good while, and I knew Cynthia would understand. She would be so happy that I was finally stepping away from the stress that was killing me. She would be relieved that I was finally choosing my life and choosing our marriage over a corporate paycheck. I walked out into the cool morning air, carrying my small box of memories, truly believing that leaving that building was the absolute worst thing that would happen to me that day. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, telling myself that the storm was finally over. I had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare had not even begun, and that the ultimate soul-crushing betrayal was waiting for me, not in the corporate boardroom, but inside the very sanctuary I had sacrificed my entire life to build. I drove away from the towering glass structure of the corporate headquarters, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. The Atlanta skyline faded in my rearview mirror as I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic on the interstate. For the first few miles, my hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned pale. I had just thrown away 25 years of my life. I had walked away from the very empire I helped build from the ground up, sacrificing my unvested shares and my professional identity in the process. The sheer disrespect of Bradley laughing in my face and tossing my resignation into the trash still stung with a bitter, humiliating intensity. But as the miles rolled by, that initial sting began to slowly recede. I forced myself to take deep, measured breaths. I tried to focus on the silver lining. I was finally free. The relentless, soul-crushing pressure that had been tightening around my heart like a vice was officially over. I was choosing my life over my career. I was choosing my family. I merged off the highway and drove toward the quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood where my true sanctuary awaited. Along the way, I pulled into the parking lot of a high-end boutique florist. I wanted to make this afternoon special. I wanted to mark the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. I bought a massive, expensive bouquet of fresh white lilies, wrapping my hands around the delicate green stems. They were Cynthia's absolute favorite flowers. I stood in the shop for a moment, smelling the sweet, fragrant blossoms, and I smiled to myself. I pictured the look of surprise and profound relief that would surely wash over her face when I walked through the front door hours earlier than usual. I imagined telling her that I had finally listened to my cardiologist. I would tell her that we no longer needed to worry about the toxic corporate grind, that we could finally use our personal savings to travel, to relax, and to actually enjoy the beautiful life we had built together. I thought about how much I loved her, how every single grueling late-night flight and stressful negotiation had been completely worth it, just to provide her with a life of absolute luxury and comfort. I drove the rest of the way home with a renewed sense of purpose. I turned onto our pristine, tree-lined street and pulled into the wide driveway of our sprawling, custom-built house. The afternoon sun was casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawn and the expensive brick facade. I shifted the car into park, but left the engine idling softly. I sat there for a moment, simply soaking in the quiet tranquility of my home. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic, cutthroat environment I had just escaped. As I sat there admiring the view, I glanced over at the empty space in the driveway where Cynthia usually parked her vehicle. I had bought her a brand new top-of-the-line luxury SUV just last month as a spontaneous anniversary gift. It was a beautiful machine equipped with the latest technology, including a highly advanced cloud-synced security and diagnostic system. Cynthia had casually mentioned over coffee earlier in the week that a yellow maintenance light was blinking on her dashboard. Before going inside the house, I figured I would do her a quick favor. The dealership had installed the vehicle's management app directly onto my smartphone so I could track the maintenance schedules and handle the servicing for her. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the dealership application. I navigated through the menus intending to check the diagnostic codes so I could call my mechanic and get the issue sorted out. The interface of the app was clunky and a little confusing to navigate. As I swiped across the screen, my thumb slipped. Instead of hitting the Vehicle Diagnostics tab, I accidentally tapped the media icon. That specific icon connected directly to the internal dual-facing dashcam system I had paid extra to install for her personal safety. The system continuously recorded both the road ahead and the interior cabin of the SUV, syncing the files directly to a secure cloud server. I did not mean to play the audio file that had been recorded just a few hours earlier that morning. It was a complete accident. But as the digital file buffered and then began to play through the high-definition speakers of my own car, my entire universe violently collapsed. At first, the audio was muffled. It was just the sound of rustling fabric, the shifting of leather seats, and the heavy, ragged breathing of two people in a confined space. I frowned, staring down at the glowing screen of my phone, trying to make sense of the strange, rhythmic noises. I thought there was a glitch in the audio feed. But then a voice cut through the static. It was a soft, breathless giggle. It was a laugh that I knew better than my own name. It was a laugh I had heard across dinner tables during quiet Sunday mornings and in the intimacy of our bedroom for the past 15 years. It was Cynthia. A cold, heavy rock dropped into the absolute pit of my stomach. My thumb hovered frantically over the screen, ready to pause the recording, desperately trying to convince my rational brain that I was somehow misunderstanding the situation. But then a man spoke in response to her laughter. His voice was deep, arrogant, and unmistakably clear. It was Bradley, my boss. The young, entitled boy who had just laughed in my face and told me I was a dinosaur walking away with nothing. He was inside the luxury SUV I had purchased with my own blood and sweat, parked somewhere in the city, engaging in an act of ultimate betrayal with my wife. The blood instantly froze in my veins. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow to the chest. I sat completely paralyzed in the driver's seat. The beautiful bouquet of white lilies rested on the passenger seat next to me, suddenly looking like a cruel, pathetic joke. The audio continued to play, raw, unfiltered, and deeply sickening. They were talking in low, intimate tones between heavy breaths. They were joking. The two entirely separate spheres of my existence, the private, sacred sanctuary of my marriage, and the demanding, high-stakes empire of my professional career, had violently collided. The man who controlled my livelihood and the woman who controlled my heart were destroying me together. I felt a wave of profound, suffocating nausea wash over me. I wanted to smash the phone against the dashboard. I wanted to scream until my lungs bled. But the sickening reality of their physical affair was only the beginning of the nightmare. What followed next in that recording turned my shock into a state of absolute, unadulterated horror. I heard Bradley's voice shift from intimate whispers to a casual, businesslike tone. He sounded completely bored as he asked a question that stopped the breath in my lungs. "Did you slip him those heart rate spikes I got you?" Bradley asked. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, gripping the device so tightly my fingers ached, praying to a higher power that I had misheard his words. Cynthia replied, and her tone was dripping with a cold, calculating malice that I did not recognize. It was not the voice of the loving wife who kissed me goodbye every morning. It was the voice of a stranger. "Yes," Cynthia answered smoothly. "His blood pressure is through the roof. He is complaining about the agonizing chest pain every single morning before he leaves for the office. He will either have a fatal stroke very soon, or the sheer crushing stress of his daily routine will force him to quit to save his own life." I closed my eyes as the jagged, terrifying pieces of the puzzle slammed together with horrifying clarity. My sudden, inexplicable hypertension, the agonizing tightness in my chest that had plagued me for months, the dizzy spells that had sent me rushing to the cardiologist in a blind panic. It was not just the overwhelming stress of my corporate job. My own wife had been systematically poisoning me. She had been secretly dosing me with a dangerous, undetectable stimulant supplied by the very man who profited off my labor. I suddenly remembered how Cynthia always insisted on making my morning coffee. I remembered how she lovingly handed me my daily vitamins, watching me swallow them with a sweet, supportive smile. She was actively trying to stop my heart. The recording kept playing mercilessly, delivering the rest of their sinister plan. Bradley let out that same arrogant, victorious chuckle I had heard in his office just hours ago. And if he quits, he automatically forfeits all his unvested shares back to the company, Bradley said, his voice laced with pure greed. I get to keep the millions he built for us, and I do not have to pay him a single dime of severance. Exactly, Cynthia responded, her voice light and cheerful. Once he throws in the towel, I file for divorce immediately. I will claim severe emotional distress from his sudden job loss and erratic behavior. With the right lawyer, I take half of his remaining cash savings, I keep the house, and we get absolutely everything. We clean the old man out completely. I sat in the driveway of my own home, the engine of my car still idling softly beneath me. The beautiful golden afternoon sun felt completely, entirely wrong, as if the world should have gone dark to match the terrifying reality I had just uncovered. My hands began to shake violently against the steering wheel. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I was not just a discarded, unappreciated employee. I was not just a tragically cheated husband. I was the targeted victim of a highly coordinated, malicious, and deadly conspiracy. The profound disrespect from Bradley in the boardroom suddenly made perfect sense. He knew I was stepping down because he and my wife had orchestrated the entire medical crisis. He threw my resignation letter in the trash because he genuinely thought he had already won the ultimate victory. They had weaponized my own body against me. They were trying to induce a fatal heart attack just to expedite their greedy, monstrous scheme. They wanted me dead or entirely destitute, and they were working together in the shadows to ensure I walked away from my life with absolutely nothing. I looked through the windshield at the beautiful house in front of me. I looked at the manicured lawn, the expensive brickwork, the life I had financed with my own rapidly deteriorating health. For one fleeting, agonizing moment, I felt a wave of profound, suffocating grief. I mourned the woman I thought I had married. I mourned the years I had wasted working for a company that was actively trying to eliminate me. But that grief did not last. It could not last. That sorrow was swiftly swallowed by something much deeper, much older, and vastly more dangerous. The shaking in my hands slowly stopped. The blind panic and the crushing heartbreak began to recede rapidly, replaced by a cold, unbreakable, and terrifying resolve. I am a 52-year-old African-American man who has survived a lifetime of systemic hurdles, ruthless corporate sharks, and impossible odds. I had clawed my way up from the bottom, building my success brick by painful brick. You do not survive in my highly competitive world by simply laying down and dying when someone stabs you in the back. You survive by turning their own blades against them. The shock morphed into a fierce, calculated anger. They thought I was a tired, sick old dinosaur who would just quietly fade away into the background. They thought I was weak. They had severely underestimated the man they were dealing with. I reached over and picked up the bouquet of white lilies from the passenger seat. I looked at the pristine, innocent flowers, and a dark, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. I was not going to confront them right now. I was not going to kick down the front door, scream about the audio recording, and show them my hand. That is what a foolish, emotional man would do. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to walk into that house, hand my murderous wife these beautiful flowers, and play the role of the defeated, exhausted husband perfectly. I would let them believe their plan was working flawlessly. I would let them bask in their false sense of victory. I turned off the engine of my car. I gripped the lilies in one hand and my leather briefcase in the other. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the paved driveway toward the heavy front door. My chest still ached, but it was no longer a pain of stress or fear. It was the burning ignition of a man preparing for war. They wanted to steal my life's work. They wanted to take my money, my home, and my dignity. But by the time I was finished with them, they would be the ones left with absolutely nothing. I stepped out of my car, and the evening air felt unusually heavy, carrying the scent of cut grass and impending rain. I stared at the solid oak front door of my home, a house I had purchased with the sweat of my brow and the sacrifice of my youth. Just an hour ago, I had uncovered a truth so vile it defied human comprehension. My wife, the woman waiting on the other side of that door, was conspiring with my boss to end my life and steal my legacy. I looked down at the pristine white lilies in my hand. They were meant to be a symbol of my devotion, a celebration of my retirement. Now they were merely a prop in the most dangerous performance of my entire life. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I could not let the boiling rage in my chest show on my face. I had to become the very thing they believed me to be. A sick, defeated, exhausted old man. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The warm, inviting aroma of roasted chicken and garlic filled the hallway, a scent that used to mean comfort and safety. Tonight, it smelled like a trap. I walked slowly, deliberately, dragging my feet, just a fraction more than usual, letting my shoulders slump forward under the weight of an invisible burden. Cynthia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine linen apron. She wore a soft, concerned smile, a perfectly rehearsed expression that hid the venom I now knew ran through her veins. When she saw the lilies, she let out a delighted gasp, rushing forward to take them from my hands. She kissed my cheek, and the touch of her lips against my skin made my stomach churn with physical revulsion. I forced a tired, grateful smile, playing my part to absolute perfection. I told her the news immediately, standing right there in the foyer. I kept my voice low, laced with a manufactured sadness. I told her I had finally done it. I had handed in my resignation. I explained that the pressure had simply become too much, that my heart could no longer take the grueling demands of the corporate world, and that I needed to step away before it killed me. Cynthia placed the flowers on the console table and wrapped her arms around my neck. She pulled me close, resting her head against my chest. She murmured sweet, soothing words of comfort, telling me how proud she was of me for choosing my health over my job. She told me we would figure everything out together. Holding the woman who was actively poisoning my morning coffee, hearing her feign relief that I was stepping down, took every ounce of restraint I possessed in my 52 years of existence. She was celebrating because she thought her sinister plan was working flawlessly. She thought I had just forfeited my unvested shares, paving the way for her to file for divorce and rob me blind. We moved into the formal dining room. The table was set beautifully, just like any other normal weekday evening. I sat at the head of the table, staring at the polished mahogany wood, a piece of furniture I had shipped from overseas, because she simply had to have it. Cynthia plated the food and sat beside me. As we ate, she reached over and began to gently rub my left shoulder. It was a familiar, intimate gesture. For years, I had interpreted that touch as a sign of her unconditional support. Tonight, I felt the cold, calculated manipulation behind her fingertips. She asked me how I was feeling, her blue eyes wide with simulated worry. She asked if my chest was still hurting, if my blood pressure was still high. I took a slow sip of water, carefully avoiding the wine she had poured for me. I told her I was completely exhausted, that my head was pounding, and that I just felt incredibly weak. The subtle, triumphant gleam that flashed across her eyes was unmistakable. She was relishing my supposed physical decline. She was waiting for me to break. The charade continued for another agonizing 20 minutes. I chewed my food mechanically, my mind racing a million miles an hour, analyzing every single word she spoke, every fake sigh of sympathy. I was a man sitting across from his executioner, engaging in polite dinner conversation. I was just about to excuse myself to go to bed, planning to lock myself in the guest room, to figure out my next move, when the sharp, sudden sound of the doorbell shattered the quiet atmosphere of the house. Cynthia stood up quickly, feigning surprise, though I could see the rigid anticipation in her posture. "I will get it," she said, hurrying toward the front door. A moment later, heavy footsteps echoed in the hardwood hallway. Greg walked into the dining room. Greg was Cynthia's younger brother, a tall, slick, white American man who walked with an unearned swagger. Looking at him, my blood boiled with a fresh, distinct layer of fury. I knew Greg's entire history because I was the one who had funded it. When I married Cynthia, Greg was a lost, lazy 20-something with mounting debts and no direction. Because I believed in taking care of my family, I had taken him in. I let him live in our furnished basement, completely rent-free, for 4 years. I paid off his massive, suffocating law school loans when he threatened to drop out. I bought him his first professional suits so he could interview at corporate firms. I had treated him like a younger brother, guiding him, supporting him, and financing his transition into adulthood. Now he stood in my dining room wearing a tailored suit that my hard-earned money had effectively subsidized, holding a thick leather briefcase. He offered me a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Jerome, man, Cynthia just texted me the news about your job," Greg said, pulling out a chair and sitting directly across from me. He placed his briefcase on the dining table with a heavy thud. I rushed over as soon as I heard. "How are you holding up, buddy?" I looked at him, feeling the absolute weight of their coordinated ambush. They had not wasted a single second. The ink on my resignation letter was barely dry, and the vultures were already circling the table. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, ragged breath, amplifying my performance of a broken, weary man. "I am surviving, Greg," I said softly. "Just trying to process everything. It has been a very long, difficult day." Greg nodded slowly, his expression morphing into one of deep professional concern. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents neatly bound in a manila folder. He slid them carefully across the polished mahogany table until they rested right in front of my plate. "Listen, Jerome, I know this is incredibly raw right now." Greg began leaning forward and folding his hands together. "But as your brother-in-law and as an attorney, I have to look out for your best interests. The corporate world is ruthless. You just walked away from a massive position, and knowing Bradley, the kid who took over your firm, he might try to come after you. He might claim you breached a contract, or he might try to sue you for damages related to clients leaving. When you are unemployed and facing potential corporate litigation, your personal assets become highly vulnerable." I stared at the thick stack of papers. The audacity of his words was staggering. He was sitting in the house I paid for, eating the food I bought, using the legal degree I financed, to systematically strip me of my wealth. I kept my face entirely neutral, though a storm of righteous indignation raged inside my soul. "What are you suggesting, Greg?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Asset protection," Greg said smoothly without missing a single beat. "It is a standard, highly recommended legal maneuver for high-net-worth individuals transitioning out of corporate roles. We need to shield your most valuable assets from any potential corporate lawsuits or creditors. The smartest, most secure way to do that right now is to transfer the deed of this house entirely into Cynthia's name." Cynthia stepped up behind my chair, placing her hands softly on my shoulders. "Greg is right, honey," she murmured, her voice dripping with fake devotion. "We just want to make sure you are protected. We want to make sure no one can take our beautiful home away from us while you are recovering and looking for your next step. We are just trying to keep you safe." The layered tension in that dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I sat absolutely still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their greed. They were not just trying to steal my unvested shares through Bradley. They were not just trying to poison me to trigger a fatal heart attack. They wanted the house. They wanted the tangible physical proof of my 25 years of labor. Greg had drawn up a quitclaim deed, a legally binding document that would strip me of my ownership rights and hand the entire property over to Cynthia. Once my name was off that deed, she would have full authority to sell the house, kick me out onto the street, and walk away with every single dime of the equity. They were trying to completely financially ruin me before the poison even had a chance to stop my heart. Greg reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. He uncapped it with a soft click and pushed it across the table, laying it deliberately on top of the documents. "It is just a simple signature, Jerome," Greg said, his voice reassuring and calm. "I will notarize it myself right here. Once it is filed, this property is completely untouchable by any of your former corporate enemies. You can rest easy knowing Cynthia has everything secured." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the complicated legal jargon printed on the top page of the deed. I felt Cynthia's fingers pressing gently into my collarbone, a physical reminder of the woman who was quietly orchestrating my demise. The urge to grab that silver pen, snap it in half, and unleash decades of suppressed fury was overwhelming. I wanted to tell Greg that I knew he was a parasitic fraud. I wanted to tell Cynthia that I had heard every single disgusting word she spoke in that SUV with my arrogant boss. I wanted to watch the smug, confident expressions completely melt off their faces as they realized I possessed the power to destroy them both. But the survival instincts of a man who had navigated brutal corporate environments for a quarter of a century kicked in. You never show your enemy your weapon until the exact moment you are ready to strike. If I confronted them now in my own dining room, they would panic. They would destroy evidence. Cynthia would immediately call her lawyers, and Bradley would accelerate his efforts to steal my intellectual property at the firm. I could not afford to let them know I was onto them. I had to play the long game. I had to let them think they were winning. I slowly reached out and picked up the silver pen. I felt the cold metal against my skin. Greg's eyes lit up with a sudden, greedy anticipation. Cynthia's grip on my shoulders tightened with eager excitement. They thought the trap was closing. They thought the sick, exhausted old man was simply going to sign his life away without reading the fine print. I held the pen over the signature line for a long, agonizing moment. My hand began to tremble, an intentional, calculated tremor to sell my performance. I let out a sharp, painful gasp, and suddenly dropped the pen onto the documents. I brought both hands up to my face, rubbing my eyes fiercely, letting out a groan of absolute misery. "I cannot focus," I whispered, my voice sounding strained and fragile. "My head is pounding, Greg. The words on the page are literally blurring together. My chest is tight, and I just feel incredibly dizzy. I think the stress of the day is finally catching up with me." Cynthia immediately leaned down, her voice laced with sudden, urgent panic. "Jerome, honey, what is wrong? Are you having chest pains again?" Greg sat up straight, his professional demeanor cracking just a fraction to reveal his immense frustration. "Jerome, it is just one signature. It will take 2 seconds. You really need to get this done tonight before the courts open tomorrow." I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes closed, playing the role of the incapacitated victim to the absolute limit. "I cannot do it tonight, Greg. I am sorry. I physically cannot process legal documents right now. My vision is swimming. I need to lie down. I need my medication and a dark room." I pushed myself up from the dining table, leaning heavily against the wooden chair for support. I looked at Greg, making sure my eyes appeared dull and completely exhausted. "Leave the papers on the table, Greg," I said, my voice barely a breathless rasp. "I promise you I will look at them first thing in the morning when my head is clear. I will sign whatever you need me to sign tomorrow. I just need to survive this night first." Greg looked at Cynthia, a silent, frustrated communication passing between them. They were annoyed, but they could not push too hard without looking suspicious. A loving wife and a concerned brother-in-law could not force a man having a supposed medical episode to sign away his property. They had to play their roles just as I was playing mine. "Okay, Jerome," Greg said smoothly, recovering his fake composure. "Health comes first. That is the most important thing. I will leave the folder right here. You get some rest. We will get it sorted out tomorrow over coffee." Cynthia wrapped her arm around my waist, guiding me slowly away from the dining table and toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "You need to sleep, my love," she murmured softly. "I will bring you your water and your evening pills right away." I nodded weakly, letting her support my weight as we walked down the hall. I knew exactly what those evening pills were. I knew they were the final, fatal mechanism in her horrific plan to erase me from existence. As I walked into the dark, quiet bedroom, I felt a profound, chilling clarity settle deep inside my bones. I had successfully bought myself the time I desperately needed. I lay down on the mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling, my heart beating with a steady, dangerous rhythm. I was no longer a victim waiting for the slaughter. I was a man who had just stepped onto a battlefield. Tomorrow morning I would not be signing any deeds. Tomorrow morning I would begin the meticulous, ruthless process of dismantling their entire world, brick by stolen brick. I was going to tear down the empire Bradley inherited. I was going to strip Greg of his unearned legal standing, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the wife who tried to put me in the ground would be the one left with nothing but the clothes on her back. The war had officially begun, and I was going to win it. The glowing red numbers on the digital clock beside the bed shifted to exactly 2 in the morning. The house was entirely silent, except for the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of the woman sleeping right next to me. I lay flat on my back on the expensive mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the steady rise and fall of Cynthia's chest. It was absolutely terrifying how easily a human being could sleep after actively conspiring to commit murder. Just a few hours ago, she had played the role of the devoted, worried wife to absolute perfection. She had rubbed my shoulders. She had offered me water to swallow my pills. She had kissed my cheek and told me to rest. Now she was fast asleep, dreaming of the luxurious, carefree life she planned to fund, with my life insurance payout and my stolen assets. I knew I could not stay in that bed a single second longer. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, poisoned by her presence. I slowly pushed the heavy duvet off my body, moving with deliberate caution. Every joint in my aging knees and lower back ached, a physical testament to the decades of relentless manual and mental labor I had endured to put a roof over her head. I placed my bare feet on the plush carpet and stood up in the darkness. I did not look back at her. I slipped quietly out of the master bedroom and walked down the long, shadowed hallway of my own home. The floorboards were cool against my feet. I walked past the guest rooms and the beautiful artwork hanging on the walls, eventually reaching the heavy oak door of my private home office. This room had always been my absolute sanctuary. It was the only place in the entire house that belonged entirely to me. The walls were lined with my professional awards, framed photographs of my early days in the insurance business, and thick binders filled with decades of commercial risk data. I stepped inside and closed the door silently behind me, making sure the latch clicked securely into place. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I only switched on the small brass desk lamp, casting a low, warm pool of light across the polished wood of my workspace. I sat down in my leather office chair and pulled my secure corporate laptop out of my briefcase. This machine held the lifeblood of my entire career. I opened the lid, and the screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a harsh, bluish glow. I typed in my complex administrative password and waited for the operating system to load. Over my 25 years in the commercial insurance sector, dealing with high-level corporate espionage and highly sensitive financial data, I had learned a great deal about digital security. You cannot protect multi-million-dollar client portfolios without understanding how vulnerable digital systems truly are. As the desktop screen finally loaded, I noticed something subtly wrong. The cooling fan inside the laptop began to spin loudly, whirring with an unusual intensity for a machine that had just been turned on. The cursor on the screen lagged for a fraction of a second when I moved the mouse. Most people would have ignored it, dismissing it as a simple software update or an old machine showing its age. But I am a man who has built an entire empire by recognizing tiny, seemingly insignificant anomalies. My instincts, sharpened by decades of navigating corporate sharks, screamed that something was fundamentally compromised. I opened the task manager and began to meticulously comb through the background processes running on the machine. My eyes scanned the long lists of code and executable files. Hidden deep within the system registry disguised under a generic system file name, I found it. It was a sophisticated, highly invasive spyware program. It was actively running, silently harvesting data and transmitting it to a remote location. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach as I traced the activity logs of the malicious software. I needed to know exactly what this program had been doing, how long it had been operating, and what specific files it had been targeting. I pulled up the transmission history, and the reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The spyware had been installed manually directly from a portable drive plugged into this very laptop. It had happened exactly 3 weeks ago during a weekend when I had been out of town visiting my older sister. Cynthia was the only person who had access to this room. The only person who knew the physical layout of my workspace, and the only person who could have easily slipped into my sanctuary to plant the digital parasite. I watched the logs scrolling across the screen, my heart pounding with a slow, measured fury. The spyware was not just indiscriminately grabbing random emails or personal passwords. It was highly targeted. It had bypassed my personal folders and tunneled straight into the heavily encrypted directory containing my proprietary insurance risk models. It was systematically downloading every single spreadsheet, every algorithm, and every predictive financial draft I had custom built for one specific client. Mr. Harrison, the name echoed in my mind, bringing a massive, horrifying revelation into sharp focus. Mr. Harrison was a notoriously reclusive billionaire logistics magnate. He owned massive shipping fleets, sprawling commercial real estate properties, and massive supply chain hubs across the entire eastern seaboard. His account was the absolute crown jewel of our insurance firm. The premiums his companies paid generated enough revenue to cover the operating costs of our entire agency. He was the only reason the firm remained highly profitable. But Mr. Harrison was a difficult, demanding man who required highly customized, incredibly complex risk mitigation strategies that took months of grueling actuarial science to develop. I was the only person in the entire agency capable of building those models. Bradley, the arrogant boy who had inherited the firm from his father, did not possess a fraction of the intellect or the work ethic required to manage an account of that magnitude. Bradley was a fraud who wore expensive suits and played golf while I did the heavy lifting. The Harrison account was up for a massive 10-year renewal this coming Friday. If our firm lost that account, Bradley would be ruined. The company would fold within 6 months. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the glowing screen as the entire sinister master plan revealed itself to me. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. Bradley knew he could never secure the Harrison renewal on his own. He knew he lacked the knowledge to answer Mr. Harrison's brutal, penetrating questions about supply chain liabilities and international shipping risks. He needed my brain. He needed my proprietary algorithms. But he also wanted to eliminate me so he would not have to pay my massive commission or honor the millions of dollars in unvested shares I had accumulated over 25 years of loyal service. So he used my wife. He seduced Cynthia, leveraging her greed and her profound lack of loyalty. He convinced her to install the spyware on my machine to steal my intellectual property. His plan was absolutely brilliant in its utter cruelty. He was going to steal my customized blueprints, present them to Mr. Harrison on Friday morning as his own brilliant work, and secure the multi-million-dollar contract for himself. And while he was doing that, Cynthia was slowly poisoning me at home, pushing my blood pressure to fatal levels. They were coordinating their attacks perfectly. They wanted me to die from a massive stroke, or at the very least, be forced to resign from the sheer crushing stress of my failing health. They would steal my professional legacy, secure their financial future, and throw my broken body into the dirt without a single ounce of remorse. A profound, suffocating silence filled my home office. I looked at the framed photographs on my desk. I saw pictures of Cynthia and me smiling on sunny beaches. I saw the silver awards I had won for top performance awards that had required me to miss family gatherings and sacrifice my own physical well-being. I had bled for a company that was now plotting to steal my soul, and I had provided for a woman who was actively planning my funeral. The betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally evil, that it completely burned away any remaining trace of sorrow or self-pity in my heart. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to confront them and demand an explanation. Explanations are for people who still believe a relationship can be salvaged. When you realize you are dealing with predators, you do not talk. You build a trap. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the keyboard. I knew I could not simply delete the spyware. If I deleted the program or changed my passwords, Bradley would instantly know I was onto him. He would panic, change his tactics, and perhaps find another way to destroy my career before Friday. I needed him to feel completely safe. I needed him to walk into that boardroom with Mr. Harrison feeling like an absolute king. The higher a man climbs on a ladder of lies, the harder he hits the concrete when you kick it out from under him. I opened the core directory containing the Harrison risk models. I am not a professional software engineer, but my decades in the corporate data sector had taught me exactly how to protect my digital assets. I created a hidden, specialized tracking macro. It was a silent string of code completely invisible to the naked eye. I carefully embedded this digital watermark directly into the financial algorithms and the presentation slides that the spyware was actively downloading. I programmed the malware to act as a silent beacon. Every single time those files were opened, copied, or printed on any unauthorized device, the tracking script would quietly ping a secure server. It would log the exact IP address, the physical geographic location of the computer, and the user credentials of whoever was accessing my stolen work. I was branding my intellectual property. When the time came, I would have irrefutable digital proof that Bradley had engaged in severe corporate espionage and grand theft. He was essentially digging his own federal prison cell with every file he stole from my hard drive. Once the tracking beacon was firmly embedded and completely undetectable, I turned my attention to my own survival. I needed to build a fortress around my remaining assets and my personal truth. I pulled a secure encrypted flash drive from a hidden compartment in my desk drawer. I transferred the audio files from my vehicle dashcam, saving the exact recording of Cynthia and Bradley discussing my murder and their financial conspiracy. I downloaded the complete logs from the spyware program, capturing the exact timestamps of the data theft. Finally, I logged into my personal banking portals and downloaded every single financial statement, asset record, and investment portfolio document I possessed. I did not trust keeping this information on a physical drive that Cynthia could potentially find and destroy. I opened an encrypted offshore cloud storage account, a digital vault completely isolated from American corporate servers and completely immune to local subpoenas. I uploaded the dashcam audio, the spyware logs, the tracking beacon data, and my financial records into the secure cloud. I locked it behind a complex multi-factor authentication wall that only I could access. The digital transfer took several long minutes. I sat in the dim light of my office watching the progress bar slowly fill across the screen. I listened to the grandfather clock in the hallway chiming 3 times. The night was slipping away, but I felt more awake, more profoundly alive than I had felt in years. The heavy, crushing exhaustion that had plagued my body for months was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating energy. When the upload finally reached 100%, I closed the web browser. I carefully logged out of the computer and shut down the machine, leaving the spyware running perfectly in the background, just as Cynthia and Bradley intended. I wiped down the desk, making absolutely sure that everything was left in the exact same position I had found it. I left no trace of my midnight espionage. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the window of my office. I pulled the heavy curtains back just a fraction and looked out at the dark, sleeping suburban neighborhood. The street lamps cast long, lonely shadows across the manicured lawns. A few hours ago, I had returned to this house believing it was my sanctuary. I had believed I was a tired old man, stepping down to enjoy a peaceful retirement with a loving wife. Now I knew the absolute truth. I was surrounded by vipers. But the vipers had made one catastrophic mistake. They had underestimated the profound resilience of a man who had built his entire existence from the ground up. They thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess, maneuvering pieces on a board to capture my wealth. They did not realize that I had just flipped the entire board over. I let the curtain fall back into place and walked quietly out of my office. I moved silently down the hallway, heading back toward the dark bedroom, where my treacherous wife was still sleeping. I would lie down beside her. I would close my eyes and continue to play the role of the sick, dying husband. I would let the coming days play out exactly as they had planned. I would endure the fake smiles, the poisoned coffee, and the arrogant disrespect, but Friday was coming. Friday was the day Bradley planned to steal my legacy and secure his empire. Friday was the day Cynthia planned to finalize my destruction. I walked through the shadows of my home, a quiet, dangerous smile forming on my face. Let them scheme. Let them steal. Let them laugh at my expense. When Friday morning finally arrived, I was going to unleash a storm of justice so absolute and so utterly devastating that it would wipe their names from the face of the earth. Morning sunlight pierced through the heavy bedroom curtains, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had been running a marathon, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I had uncovered in my home office just hours earlier. I lay perfectly still, listening to the sounds of the house waking up around me. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clinking of porcelain mugs and the low murmuring voices of my wife and her brother. They were likely discussing their final strategy, confident that today was the day they would strip me of my most valuable asset. I slowly pushed myself out of bed, feeling the stiff ache in my joints. I showered, shaved, and dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. If I was going to face my executioners, I was going to do it, looking like the man who built this empire, not the broken victim they desperately wanted me to be. I walked down the curved wooden staircase, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. The smell of freshly brewed hazelnut coffee drifted from the kitchen. It was the same coffee Cynthia had been lacing with dangerous stimulants to drive my blood pressure to fatal levels. I stepped into the bright sunlit room. Cynthia was standing by the marble island, wearing a pristine silk robe, pouring a steaming cup. Greg was sitting at the breakfast nook, already dressed in his lawyer attire, casually flipping through a financial magazine. When I entered, Cynthia turned with a bright manufactured smile. She held the coffee mug out toward me, her eyes brimming with that toxic, fake warmth. "Good morning, my love," she cooed softly. "I made your favorite. You need your energy today. We have to get that paperwork sorted out so you can finally rest." I looked at the ceramic mug in her hand. I looked at the dark liquid swirling inside it, knowing it was laced with a venom meant to stop my heart. I did not take it. I simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch out, until the manufactured smile on her face began to twitch. I walked past her, ignoring the coffee entirely, and poured myself a glass of cold tap water from the sink. Greg cleared his throat, setting his magazine aside. He tapped his fingers against the thick manila folder resting on the table. "Jerome," Greg said, adopting his most reasonable professional tone. "I know yesterday was incredibly stressful. Quitting your job is a massive transition. But we really need to finalize this quitclaim deed this morning. Protecting this house from corporate litigation is paramount. Cynthia just wants to make sure you have a safe place to land." I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool liquid coat my dry throat. I set the glass down on the granite counter with a sharp, definitive clack. I looked directly into Greg's eyes, dropping the exhausted, confused old man routine completely. "I read the documents, Greg," I said, my voice resonating with a deep, unwavering authority. "I am not signing them. I am not transferring the deed of my home to anyone. This conversation is over." The atmosphere in the kitchen shattered instantly. The fake warmth evaporated, sucked out of the room like air from a depressurized cabin. Greg sat up straight, his jaw tightening, the friendly brother-in-law act vanishing to reveal the greedy parasite underneath. Cynthia placed the poisoned coffee mug down on the counter. She turned to face me, and for the first time in 15 years of marriage, I saw her true, unmasked face. There was no love. There was no sympathy. There was only a cold, predatory rage. "What do you mean you are not signing?" Cynthia demanded, her voice dropping an octave, harsh and grating. "We discussed this last night, Jerome. You are unemployed. You are a liability. If your former company comes after you for breach of contract, they will take this house. You are being stubborn and foolish." I stood my ground, squaring my shoulders. "I said what I said, Cynthia. I am not signing away the property I worked 25 years to pay for. If Bradley wants to sue me, let him try. I will take my chances in court. But my name stays on that deed." Cynthia took a step toward me, her blue eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. She realized that the soft manipulation had failed. She realized the sick, tired husband routine was over. And like a cornered animal, she immediately resorted to the most destructive weapon in her arsenal. Without breaking eye contact, Cynthia reached across the marble island and grabbed her smartphone. She did not hesitate. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen. She took a deep breath, and right before my eyes, she completely transformed. Her face crumpled into an expression of absolute, abject terror. She let out a sudden, blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high ceilings of our suburban home. With her free hand, she violently swept a row of expensive porcelain plates off the counter. They crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. "Yes, 911, she shrieked into the phone, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "Please, you have to help me. My husband is going crazy. He just lost his job and he is destroying the house. He is threatening me. He said he is going to kill me. Please send someone quickly. I am terrified." I stood perfectly still, watching the monstrous performance unfold. She sobbed uncontrollably into the receiver, feeding the dispatcher a fabricated story of a violent, unhinged man. Greg stood up from the table, backing away toward the wall, playing the role of the intimidated bystander perfectly. He was giving her the space to create a legally binding crisis. As an African-American man standing in a wealthy, predominantly white suburban neighborhood, I knew exactly how dangerous this situation had just become. If I raised my voice, if I took a single step toward her, if I showed even a fraction of the righteous anger burning in my soul, I would leave this house in handcuffs. I would be arrested, charged with domestic assault, and my entire reputation would be destroyed before I even had a chance to fight back in court. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands open and visible at my sides. I maintained a calm, steady breathing pattern. 10 agonizing minutes later, the wail of police sirens pierced the quiet morning air. Heavy tires screeched into our driveway. Heavy fists pounded on the front door. Greg rushed to answer it, pulling the door open with an expression of deep, frantic concern. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Their eyes immediately swept the scene. They saw the shattered porcelain plates scattered across the kitchen floor. They saw Cynthia huddled against the marble island, sobbing into her hands, trembling violently. And they saw me, a tall, silent black man standing in the center of the room. The officers moved swiftly, separating us. One officer gently guided Cynthia into the living room, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. The other officer approached me, his stance wide and commanding. He asked me what was going on. I kept my voice perfectly even, polite, and respectful. "Officer," I said calmly, "my wife and I are having a disagreement regarding the signing of property documents. I refused to sign a deed transferring this house to her. She became upset, swept those plates off the counter herself, and called you. I have not touched her. I have not raised my voice. I am simply standing here." Before the officer could process my statement, Greg stepped forward, sliding seamlessly into his role as the legal authority. "Officer, my name is Gregory. I am her brother and her attorney," he said smoothly. "My brother-in-law suffered a severe mental breakdown yesterday after suddenly resigning from his corporate position. His behavior has become highly erratic and deeply threatening. My sister is genuinely fearing for her life. He cornered her in the kitchen just now. You can see the destruction he caused. Under the state domestic disturbance codes, we are formally requesting that he be removed from the premises immediately to prevent further escalation and potential bodily harm." I watched Greg deploy his legal jargon with sickening precision. He was using the very law degree I had paid for to orchestrate my removal from my own property. The officer looking at me was not a bad man, but he was bound by strict protocol. He looked at the broken plates. He heard Cynthia's relentless, Oscar-worthy sobbing from the other room. He heard a well-dressed lawyer citing legal codes. In a domestic dispute where a woman claims she fears for her life, the police almost always ask the male party to leave the residence to cool the situation down. It is a standard de-escalation tactic. The officer turned back to me, his expression firm, but slightly sympathetic. "Sir, I do not see any physical marks on anyone, but emotions are running dangerously high right now," the officer said. "Your wife is visibly distressed. Under these circumstances, I cannot force you out permanently without a court order, but for everyone's safety, I am going to have to ask you to pack a bag and leave the premises for the night." You need to go find a hotel and let things cool down here. If you refuse and she presses formal charges of making terroristic threats, I will have to place you under arrest. Please do not make me do that." I looked at the officer weighing my options. I could argue. I could demand they dust the broken plates for fingerprints to prove I never touched them. But I knew it was a losing battle. Arguing with the police in this highly charged environment would only play directly into Cynthia and Greg's narrative of an unhinged, angry man. I needed my freedom. I needed access to my lawyers and my offshore cloud servers. A night in a holding cell would destroy my timeline and give Bradley the opening he needed to steal my client on Friday. I had to swallow the bitter, jagged pill of momentary injustice. "I understand, officer," I said quietly. "I will pack a bag and leave voluntarily. I will not cause any trouble." The officer nodded, gesturing for me to proceed upstairs. I walked up the heavy wooden steps, feeling the profound humiliation burning in my chest. I walked into the master bedroom, the room where Cynthia had slept so soundly after plotting my death just a few hours prior. I pulled a small leather suitcase from the closet. I did not pack much. Just a few crisp suits, some clean shirts, my essential toiletries, and most importantly, my secure corporate laptop and my hidden encrypted hard drives. I carefully placed the digital evidence of their entire conspiracy into the bottom of the bag, zipping it shut with a definitive, satisfying sound. I carried the suitcase down the stairs. The officers were waiting in the foyer. Cynthia was standing near the living room archway, leaning against Greg for support, still clutching a tissue to her face. As I walked past them toward the heavy oak front door, she lowered the tissue just a fraction. Our eyes locked for a single fleeting second. The tears were gone. Her blue eyes were bright, hard, and utterly triumphant. She had successfully wielded the system against me. She had weaponized the police to physically remove me from my own kingdom. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect coup. I stepped out onto the front porch. The morning air was crisp and biting. The police officers followed me out, waiting until I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. I looked at the beautiful suburban house I had sacrificed decades of my life to pay for. The manicured lawn, the expensive brick facade, the large bay windows. I had bled for that house. Now I was being chased away from it like a common criminal. As I put the car in reverse, I glanced up at the large living room window. Cynthia and Greg were standing there side by side. They were no longer hiding behind the facade of a terrified victim and a concerned brother. They were looking down at me, and they were smirking. It was a vile, arrogant, victorious smirk. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded a helpless, sick old man. They thought I was driving away to a cheap motel to lick my wounds and wait for my inevitable financial slaughter. But as I drove down the pristine, tree-lined street, watching my house disappear in the rearview mirror, the profound sense of loss completely evaporated. The sadness was gone. The humiliation was burned away by a cold, righteous, and terrifying clarity. Cynthia and Greg thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had cornered a dying animal. But they were absolute fools. They had not defeated me. They had simply removed the final chains holding me back. They had just unleashed a seasoned, ruthless wolf who now had absolutely nothing left to lose. I merged onto the highway, pointing my car toward the city skyline. I was not going to a motel to hide. I was going to war, and I was going to burn their entire stolen empire to the ground. The city lights of downtown Atlanta began to bleed through my windshield, cutting through the dark suburban void I had just left behind. I was a man who had literally just been escorted off his own property by the local police, framed by a treacherous wife and her parasitic brother. By all standard definitions, I should have been a broken shell of a human being. I should have been sitting on a lumpy mattress in a cheap roadside motel, staring at a stained ceiling, drinking myself into a stupor, and wondering where my life went wrong. I should have been paralyzed by the sheer terror of starting over at 52 years old with my entire financial foundation suddenly ripped out from under me. But sorrow is a luxury meant for peacetime. When you are standing in the middle of an active war zone, grief will only get you killed. The cold steering wheel beneath my hands felt like a solid anchor, holding me to reality. I navigated the dense evening traffic with a singular, razor-sharp focus. Cynthia and Greg believed they had successfully isolated me. They assumed I was financially paralyzed and emotionally destroyed by the humiliation of being cast out of my own sanctuary. Meanwhile, my arrogant former boss, Bradley, thought he had a clear, undisputed path to steal my life's work and secure his unearned empire this coming Friday. They were all dead wrong. They had pushed me to the very edge of the cliff, never realizing that I had spent 25 years learning exactly how to fly in hurricane winds. I bypassed the cheap motels on the outskirts of the city and drove straight into the beating heart of the financial district. I pulled my car into a discreet, dimly lit parking structure just half a block away from the capital city cigar lounge. This was not a trendy nightclub with loud music and flashing neon lights. It was a deeply exclusive old money establishment tucked away behind a heavy, unmarked oak door on a quiet side street. The men who gathered inside those brick walls did not negotiate their business via casual emails or quick phone calls. They built generational fortunes over glasses of impossibly expensive scotch and thick imported cigars. I knew this location intimately because I knew my most valuable client intimately. Richard Harrison was a self-made billionaire logistics magnate. He controlled shipping fleets, massive industrial warehouses, and complex supply chain arteries that stretched across the entire eastern seaboard and beyond. Despite his immense, almost incomprehensible wealth, Mr. Harrison was a deeply traditional man. He operated on the uncompromising principles of absolute loyalty, unvarnished truth, and the sacred binding power of a firm handshake. Over the past decade, I had earned my highly coveted seat at his table by speaking to him with straight, unapologetic honesty. As an African-American professional navigating boardrooms filled with inherited privilege, I always had to be 10 times sharper and outwork everyone else in the building. Mr. Harrison respected my relentless work ethic because he recognized the exact same grueling blue-collar grind that had originally built his own massive fortune. I parked my vehicle in the shadows of the concrete structure and stepped out into the crisp, biting night air. I buttoned my suit jacket against the sudden chill, walking over to the private valet lane directly behind the cigar lounge. I stood near a massive brick pillar perfectly concealed in the darkness and waited. The cold of the pavement seeped slowly through the leather soles of my shoes, serving as a stark physical reminder of my sudden displacement. My single suitcase was still sitting in the trunk of my car nearby, holding the absolute entirety of my remaining material life. Yet as I stood there in the quiet dark, I did not feel homeless. I felt an immense surging wave of raw, unadulterated power coursing through my veins. I reached down and pulled the thick, confidential file folder from my heavy leather briefcase. Inside those manila covers were the genuine, untampered blueprints of the complex commercial risk mitigation models I had meticulously built for Mr. Harrison over the past 6 agonizing months. Alongside those blueprints were the digital tracking logs I had covertly pulled from my compromised home computer just a few hours prior. My entire future was resting inside that leather bag. It was nearing 11 o'clock when the heavy brass-handled side door of the lounge finally swung open, spilling warm amber light and the rich scent of cured tobacco out onto the pavement. Mr. Harrison stepped out onto the sidewalk, accompanied closely by his personal driver and a private security guard. He was an imposing, broad-shouldered figure, a man in his late 60s with sharp, discerning eyes beneath thick gray eyebrows. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the pool of amber light. The security guard immediately tensed, shifting his weight and moving swiftly to intercept me, but Mr. Harrison held up a single authoritative hand. He recognized my face instantly. A look of genuine surprise flickered across his weathered features, replacing his usual stoic expression. "Jerome," Mr. Harrison said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying a tone of cautious curiosity. "What in the world are you doing out here in the cold? At this hour, I thought we were scheduled to finalize the massive renewal package at your corporate office on Friday morning. I certainly did not expect a preliminary ambush in an alleyway." I did not offer a polite, deferential greeting. I did not waste his highly valuable time with empty small talk, or offer weak apologies for the sudden aggressive intrusion. I walked right past his security guard, stepping straight up to the gleaming black hood of his customized luxury Bentley parked at the curb. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice incredibly steady, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who knows his exact worth in the marketplace. "We are not meeting on Friday. And if you sign the commercial contract that Bradley puts in front of you later this week, you will be making the most catastrophic financial mistake of your entire professional career." Mr. Harrison did not flinch. He did not dismiss me as a disgruntled employee, nor did he instruct his guard to push me away. He stepped closer to the vehicle, his sharp eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, penetrating intensity. I placed my leather briefcase firmly on the hood of the Bentley and snapped the brass latches open with a loud, definitive click. I pulled out the thick stack of proprietary documents and spread them flat across the polished metal surface, right under the bright glow of the street lamp. I did not beg for his sympathy. I did not utter a single word about my treacherous wife, the false police report, or my stolen home. Personal tragedies have absolutely no place in a high-stakes corporate negotiation. I focused entirely on the numbers, the hard data, and the undeniable, sickening betrayal of his professional trust. I pointed directly to the complex actuarial tables I had personally designed to shield his vast international shipping fleets from devastating liability. I showed him the precise, customized algorithms that accounted for his unique workforce vulnerabilities across dozens of separate states. "These are the original, uncorrupted blueprints for your upcoming decade of commercial coverage," I explained, tapping my index finger hard against the heavy cardstock. "I spent the last 6 months of my life building this exact framework to ensure your logistics empire remains utterly untouchable by market crashes or union lawsuits. But the boy who just inherited my firm does not understand a single page of this math. Bradley is an absolute fraud. He lacks the fundamental intellectual competence to manage an account of your magnitude. So when I handed in my resignation this morning due to my failing health, he decided to steal my intellect." I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out the secondary stack of papers. These were the digital tracking logs, the irrefutable, undeniable proof generated by the tracking malware I had secretly embedded in my own stolen files. I laid out the time-stamped records, showing him exactly how Bradley had accessed my highly encrypted directories through a malicious spyware program planted on my personal home network. "Bradley is actively downloading these exact risk models right now." I continued, my tone ringing with a cold, righteous authority. "But because he does not comprehend the complex architecture of my work, he has fundamentally altered the back-end financial structures to benefit himself. I have the digital proof right here in my hands. He is going to present you with a plagiarized, critically flawed version of this policy on Friday morning. He has purposefully buried hidden administrative fees and massively inflated premium margins deep within the fine print of the contract language. He is planning to skim millions of dollars directly off the top of your operational budget to line his own pockets, completely compromising your legal liability in the process. I watched the dark realization wash over the billionaire's face. The casual, relaxed demeanor he had carried out of the cigar lounge completely evaporated into the cold night air. Mr. Harrison's features turned to solid stone. His jaw clenched so tightly I could clearly see the muscles working fiercely beneath his skin. He was a man who had spent his entire existence building a massive commercial empire on the absolute foundation of trust and mutual respect, and he had just realized that an arrogant, entitled boy was trying to play him for an absolute fool. He leaned over the hood of the Bentley, ignoring the cold metal, and picked up the digital tracking logs. He adjusted his glasses, reading the highlighted IP addresses and the undeniable time-stamped evidence of corporate espionage. He cross-referenced the stolen data logs with the original blueprints I had provided. I stood in perfect silence, letting the undeniable weight of the betrayal sink deep into his bones. He dropped the papers back onto the hood of his car, his chest heaving with a slow, controlled breath. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and intensely dangerous. The ambient sounds of the distant city traffic seemed to completely fade away. Mr. Harrison looked up from the scattered documents and stared directly at me. He did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum. His voice dropped to a low, lethal register that carried the profound weight of absolute destruction. Jerome, Mr. Harrison said, the cold fury vibrating in every single deliberate syllable. The only reason I ever did business with that agency in the first place was because of you. I merely tolerated that arrogant boy's father, but I implicitly trusted you. You have protected my assets flawlessly for an entire decade. You have saved my companies from ruin more times than I can count. Give me one good, solid reason not to call my legal team right now and completely cancel this multi-million-dollar contract with his firm. This was the moment. This was the exact razor-sharp pivot point where the trajectory of my entire existence would change forever. All the pain, all the betrayal, and all the profound humiliation of the past 24 hours crystallized into a singular point of overwhelming power. I looked the billionaire dead in the eye, standing tall in the cold street air, radiating the unyielding strength of a man who had just taken full, uncompromising control of his own destiny. Because by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will have my own firm officially registered. I told him my words, sharp, absolute, and completely devoid of hesitation. And if you follow me, I will personally guarantee to save you 20% on your entire corporate portfolio while cutting that parasitic boy entirely out of the equation. Mr. Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. The cold, dangerous anger in his eyes shifted immediately into a deep, profound respect. He saw the undeniable fire in my soul. He recognized the fierce, unyielding resilience of a man who absolutely refuses to be broken by the treachery of those he once trusted. He reached his hand straight across the hood of the luxury vehicle and extended his arm. I reached out and gripped his hand firmly, feeling the solid, heavy promise of his handshake seal the deal. In that quiet, dimly lit parking lot, the financial foundation of Bradley's stolen empire was completely and utterly annihilated. I had just secured the ultimate weapon to destroy my enemies. Now it was time to build my impenetrable fortress. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was a far better stimulant than whatever poison Cynthia had been slipping into my morning coffee. I drove away from the private cigar club through the empty sleeping streets of downtown Atlanta as the first hints of dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of deep purple and bruised orange. My midnight meeting with Mr. Harrison had shifted the entire axis of my universe. I was no longer a discarded employee or a man running from his executioners. I was the architect of their impending demise. But to bring down an entire corporate agency and a treacherous family, I needed a massive arsenal. I needed absolute financial and legal firepower, and I needed it immediately. Growing up in a household where money was a constant, suffocating struggle teaches a man certain fundamental survival skills. When I started making real money in the commercial insurance sector 2 decades ago, I made a quiet, unshakable vow to never let myself be caught completely defenseless. I knew that in corporate America, the floor could drop out from under you at any given second. So I opened a private, heavily guarded account at a small community bank on the opposite side of the city. It was my ultimate safety net, completely disconnected from the joint finances I shared with Cynthia. I diverted a small, unnoticeable percentage of my annual performance bonuses into that account every single year. Over 25 years of compound interest and smart conservative investments, that secret vault had grown into a formidable war chest. It was the exact financial ammunition I needed to buy my justice. At 9 o'clock sharp that morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of one of the most ruthless, high-end corporate litigation firms in Buckhead. I did not want friendly neighborhood attorneys who negotiated peaceful settlements. I wanted apex predators. I sat across a massive, polished granite table from Thomas Harrington, a senior partner with sharp silver hair and a terrifying reputation for financially dismantling opposing counsel. I did not waste his highly expensive time with emotional grievances or complaints about my broken marriage. I laid out the dashcam audio transcripts, the detailed spyware data logs, and my firm intentions to form a new corporate entity to absorb the massive Harrison Logistics account by Friday morning. Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepled his fingers, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He recognized a bulletproof, highly lucrative case when he saw one. The next 48 hours were a blur of intense, highly coordinated action. Thomas immediately deployed his rapid response corporate team. We filed the articles of organization with the state of Georgia, securing the federal tax identification numbers, the corporate domain registries, and the essential liability licenses required to operate a top-tier commercial insurance brokerage. We pushed through expedited applications for errors and omissions coverage, leveraging my spotless 25-year industry record to bypass the usual waiting periods. I named my new enterprise Hayes Risk Solutions. Watching my own name printed on those official state documents was a profoundly emotional experience. It was the sudden, undeniable rebirth of my professional dignity. By Wednesday evening, my new company was legally registered, fully operational, and completely ready to absorb a multi-million-dollar logistics portfolio. While the corporate lawyers were working around the clock to build my new empire, my private investigator was busy excavating the filthy, hidden truth behind my brother-in-law. I had hired an old contact, a retired federal financial investigator named Calvin, to dig deep into Greg and his supposedly successful law practice. Greg was a man who walked around with an unearned swagger, believing his law degree made him inherently superior to a self-made black man like me. But privilege often breeds sheer, unadulterated laziness. Calvin proved that theory right within 24 hours of opening the investigation. Calvin discovered that Greg was not just giving my wife bad legal advice regarding the deed to my house. He was actively orchestrating a massive, highly illegal financial drain on my personal assets. Calvin pulled public property records, sealed court filings, and highly confidential banking transfer requests that had my signature printed boldly at the bottom. I stared at the documents Calvin laid out on the table in my temporary hotel room, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. My signatures were perfect, meticulously practiced forgeries. Greg had used his position as an attorney to acquire a counterfeit notary seal, He had been secretly filing falsified power of attorney documents, with the county clerk essentially granting Cynthia complete administrative control over my most liquid mutual funds and stock portfolios. But the true sickening depth of their conspiracy revealed itself when Calvin utilized his forensic accounting software to trace exactly where that stolen money was going. Greg was not just transferring my hard-earned wealth into Cynthia and her personal checking accounts. He was routing the funds through a highly complex web of obscure short-term shell companies, specifically designed to wash the money clean and avoid tax flags. Calvin tracked the digital footprints across multiple wire transfers, following the money all the way to a private offshore banking institution in the Cayman Islands. And the primary beneficiary listed on those hidden offshore accounts was none other than Bradley. The devastating reality hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. Cynthia, Greg, and Bradley were not just a group of greedy opportunists. They were operating as a highly coordinated, incredibly vicious criminal triad. Cynthia provided the intimate access to my home and the physical poison to weaken my heart. Greg provided the fraudulent legal cover and the forged notary seals to bypass the bank security protocols without triggering fraud alerts. Bradley provided the offshore financial infrastructure to hide the stolen money, all while plotting to steal my intellectual property to save his failing commercial agency. They had covered every single angle. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime against a man they viewed as entirely disposable. But they had left a massive, undeniable trail of digital and paper evidence, and I was holding all the receipts. I returned to the law firm on Thursday morning, stepping into the main war room with Thomas and his team of associate attorneys. I did not just sit back and let them do all the work. I rolled up my sleeves, drank endless cups of black coffee, and actively wove my intimate knowledge of their personal and financial habits directly into our aggressive legal strategy. We began drafting a series of devastating, airtight emergency injunctions. Thomas explained exactly how we were going to spring the trap. We were not going to simply file a standard police report and wait for a slow, bureaucratic criminal investigation to unfold. We were going to strike them in civil court with overwhelming, paralyzing force before they even realized they were under attack. We drafted comprehensive motions for immediate asset freezes, temporary restraining orders against Bradley and Greg, and a massive civil suit citing corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, gross marital misconduct, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Every single document we drafted was backed by irrefutable, ironclad proof. We attached the certified audio recordings of my attempted murder from the vehicle dashcam. We included the highly technical spyware logs showing Bradley actively stealing my risk models from my home network. We submitted the forged notary stamps and the offshore routing numbers proving Greg was systematically siphoning my wealth. I provided detailed affidavits outlining exactly how the medications in my home had been tampered with. We were building a legal cage so thick and so strong that neither a high-priced defense attorney nor their inherent social privilege could possibly save them. We worked late into the night, the only sounds in the room being the rapid clicking of keyboards and the humming of the heavy-duty office printers. I looked at the towering stacks of injunctions and legal briefs resting on the long mahogany conference table. Each page represented a piece of my stolen life being forcefully reclaimed. My chest did not hurt anymore. My hands were perfectly steady. The trap was meticulously set, armed with razor-sharp steel and perfectly hidden beneath the surface of their immense arrogance. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the exact day Bradley thought he was going to conquer the world and save his father's company. Tomorrow was the day Cynthia thought she would become a wealthy, unburdened widow. They had absolutely no idea that I was holding the trigger to a legal and financial explosive charge that would level their entire reality to dust. Friday morning arrived with a cold, piercing clarity. The sky over Atlanta was a brilliant cloudless blue, washing the towering glass structures of the financial district in a harsh and unforgiving light. I stood at the base of the massive granite steps leading up to the county civil court building, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Just 2 days ago, I had been escorted off my own manicured driveway by local law enforcement holding a single leather suitcase treated like a volatile threat in the very neighborhood I had helped build. I had walked away in silence, absorbing the profound humiliation as my wife and her parasitic brother smiled from the window of the home my blood and sweat had paid for. They had expected me to crumble. They had expected me to retreat into the shadows, a defeated, sick old man waiting for the final blow. They had severely miscalculated. Walking beside me was Thomas Harrington, a senior corporate litigator whose reputation in this city was built on a foundation of absolute scorched earth legal warfare. Thomas carried a thick, reinforced briefcase containing the meticulously compiled evidence of my survival. We did not march up those granite steps as victims seeking simple mediation. We walked into that courthouse as architects of a total financial and legal demolition. The grand rotunda of the courthouse was a swirling ocean of stressed individuals, overworked public defenders, and nervous plaintiffs. The acoustics of the building amplified the frantic energy, echoing with the sounds of hushed arguments and clacking dress shoes against the polished marble floors. I kept my posture rigid, my chin elevated, my breathing slow and measured. I scanned the crowded hallway leading to the civil filing clerk's office, and within moments I spotted them. Cynthia and Greg were standing near a heavy wooden bench, completely oblivious to my presence. They looked absolutely triumphant. Cynthia was wearing a tasteful, conservative designer dress, playing the role of the worried, long-suffering spouse to absolute perfection. Greg stood beside her, leaning casually against the marble pillar, holding the manila folder that contained their fraudulent quitclaim deed and their malicious petitions. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were waiting in line to file an emergency motion to freeze all of my personal checking and savings accounts. They were planning to claim that my sudden unemployment and my supposed mental instability required immediate court intervention to prevent me from squandering our marital assets. They thought they were driving the final nail into my financial coffin, cutting off my ability to hire legal counsel or secure permanent housing. They were laughing softly together, sharing a quiet, private joke. They looked like two predators admiring a fresh kill. I did not approach them. I did not give them the satisfaction of a dramatic, screaming confrontation in the middle of a public hallway. Thomas placed a firm hand on my shoulder and guided me silently down a separate, restricted corridor reserved exclusively for senior attorneys and judicial staff. We were not going to the public filing desk. We were going straight to the top, haute d'échelon. Because of the overwhelming severity of the criminal evidence we possessed, Thomas had leveraged his considerable influence to secure a rare, highly prioritized ex parte emergency hearing with the presiding civil judge, Judge Robert Miller. An ex parte hearing is a legal maneuver that allows one party to present urgent evidence to a judge without the opposing party being present, typically used when there is an immediate proven threat of asset flight, corporate sabotage, or severe bodily harm. We had all three. We stepped into the quiet wood-paneled sanctuary of Judge Miller's private chambers. The noise of the crowded rotunda vanished instantly, replaced by the solemn, heavy atmosphere of pure judicial authority. Judge Miller was a stern veteran jurist with tired eyes and a reputation for possessing absolutely zero tolerance for fraud. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, looking over his spectacles as Thomas and I took our seats. Thomas did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and began to lay out the arsenal we had constructed over the past 48 hours. It was a masterpiece of legal execution. Thomas started with the financial records. He handed the judge the certified documents my private investigator had unearthed, pointing directly to the falsified power of attorney forms. He laid out the counterfeit notary seals Greg had used to bypass the security protocols of my investment portfolios. He showed the judge the exact routing numbers, proving that Greg had been quietly siphoning my mutual funds into offshore shell accounts listed under Bradley's name. Judge Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep concentration as he examined the forged documents. The air in the room grew incredibly still. Civil judges see greed every single day, but the sheer brazen arrogance of a licensed attorney committing felony forgery to rob a family member is a different level of transgression. But Thomas was not finished. He reached into his briefcase and produced the technical spyware logs. He explained to the judge that the offshore accounts were directly tied to a massive corporate espionage plot. He showed the time-stamped evidence proving that Bradley had orchestrated the installation of a malicious tracking program on my personal home network, actively stealing proprietary commercial risk models to save his failing insurance agency. Thomas painted the complete picture, connecting the offshore money laundering directly to the corporate theft. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This is a massive conspiracy, Counselor Judge Miller," said his voice grave and low. "You are alleging that this man's wife, his brother-in-law, and his former employer are operating a coordinated criminal syndicate. This goes far beyond a simple civil asset freeze." "That is exactly what we are alleging, Your Honor," Thomas replied smoothly, his tone laced with absolute certainty. "But the financial fraud and the corporate espionage are merely the mechanisms of their greed. The true depravity of their conspiracy lies in how they intended to eliminate my client completely." Thomas pulled a small, high-definition digital audio player from his pocket and placed it squarely in the center of the judge's mahogany desk. He pressed the play button. The pristine, quiet atmosphere of the judicial chambers was suddenly filled with the raw, unfiltered audio from my vehicle's dash cam. The sound of Cynthia's soft, breathless giggle echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Then came Bradley's arrogant voice. Then came the words that had completely shattered my universe just days prior. The judge sat perfectly still, listening, as my wife smoothly and cheerfully confirmed that she had been slipping dangerous, undetectable stimulants into my morning coffee. He listened as she casually described my skyrocketing blood pressure, my agonizing chest pains, and my inevitable impending stroke. He heard them laughing about how my sudden death or forced resignation would allow them to steal my unvested shares, seize my home, and completely clean me out. I watched Judge Miller's face transform. The professional, detached curiosity of a seasoned magistrate vanished, replaced by a cold, visceral disgust. He stared at the audio player as if it were a venomous snake resting on his desk. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence in the room was deafening. No one spoke for a long, heavy moment. Judge Miller picked up his pen. He did not ask any further questions. He did not request additional clarification. He pulled the thick stack of emergency injunctions and restraining orders Thomas had drafted toward him, and he began to sign his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes. He signed the order to completely freeze every single domestic and international bank account associated with Gregory and Cynthia. He signed the emergency injunction freezing the corporate operating accounts of Bradley's insurance agency, effectively halting any ability Bradley had to conduct business or move stolen funds. He signed the immediate temporary restraining orders prohibiting all three of them from coming within 500 feet of me, my properties, or my newly established corporate enterprise. "You have your orders," Counselor Judge Miller said, handing the thick stack of signed documents back to Thomas. "I am also forwarding these audio transcripts and the forgery evidence directly to the District Attorney's Major Crimes Division and the State Bar Association. These people are a profound danger to the public." I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I thanked the judge, my voice steady and respectful, but inside a massive roaring fire of vindication was burning through my chest. We walked out of the judge's chambers and stepped back into the chaotic noise of the main rotunda. Thomas and I walked deliberately toward the civil filing area. Cynthia and Greg were finally approaching the front of the line, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just been vaporized. Greg was holding his manila folder, looking incredibly smug, chatting softly with Cynthia. She was holding her expensive smartphone, tapping the screen with a manicured finger. We intercepted them right in the middle of the grand marble hallway. Greg looked up and saw me approaching. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, straightening his posture and adjusting his silk tie. Cynthia narrowed her eyes, stepping slightly behind her brother, instantly dropping the terrified victim routine she had played so perfectly for the police. Jerome, Greg said loudly, ensuring the people standing nearby could hear his authoritative, condescending tone. You really should not be here. You are violating the spirit of the police separation order. We are simply filing the standard protective paperwork. You need to leave before Cynthia feels threatened again. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at him, feeling the absolute towering superiority of a man who held their entire existence in his hands. Thomas stepped forward, holding the stack of freshly signed court-stamped documents. He did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the noise of the hallway like a freshly sharpened blade. Gregory Thomas said smoothly, his eyes locking onto the younger man. My name is Thomas Harrington. I represent your brother-in-law. You are hereby served with an emergency ex parte injunction issued directly by Judge Miller just 3 minutes ago. Thomas shoved the thick stack of papers directly into Greg's chest, forcing the younger lawyer to grab them instinctively. Greg looked down at the documents, his eyes scanning the bold black lettering of the judicial seal. I watched the exact moment his legal brain processed the terrifying reality of what he was holding. The smug, arrogant color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. His hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rattled against his suit jacket. Well, what is this? Cynthia demanded, stepping forward, her voice sharp and agitated. Greg, what does that say? Tell him we are freezing his accounts. Tell him he has no right to be here. Greg could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was reading the specific clauses detailing his felony forgery, the offshore money laundering, and the immediate suspension of his legal ability to practice law pending a criminal investigation. He was reading the total destruction of his life. Cynthia snatched the papers from her brother's trembling hands. She began to read, her eyes darting frantically across the pages. As she read the transcript of the dashcam audio, the mention of the heart rate, spikes, the poison, and the specific details of her affair with Bradley, her breath hitched in her throat. She looked up at me, her blue eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. The mask was completely gone. She finally realized that I knew everything. She realized that I had walked into that dining room, accepted her fake comfort, and played her for an absolute fool while I built the mechanism of her ruin. Right at that exact moment, Cynthia's smartphone chimed loudly in her hand. Then it chimed again, and again. A rapid, relentless series of digital notifications filled the tense air between us. She looked down at the glowing screen. I knew exactly what those notifications were. The judicial freeze orders were electronic and immediate. Her platinum credit cards were being systematically declined and locked. Her personal checking accounts, the ones filled with my stolen money, were being frozen by the banking institutions. Her access to the wealth she believed she had successfully stolen was being severed in real time. My phone, she whispered, her voice cracking, sounding incredibly small and terrified. Everything is locked. My accounts, my cards, everything says 0. Greg pulled his own phone from his pocket. his fingers shaking uncontrollably. He stared at his screen, confirming the exact same devastating reality. The offshore accounts were seized. His domestic funds were frozen. He was completely broke, standing in the middle of the courthouse holding the undeniable proof of his own impending federal indictment. Just then my own phone vibrated in my suit pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a short, encrypted text message from my private investigator. It confirmed that federal marshals had just arrived at Bradley's commercial insurance agency to serve the corporate espionage injunctions. Bradley's business accounts were locked down. His firm was paralyzed. The stolen Harrison blueprints were completely useless to him now. The multi-million-dollar renewal he thought he was stealing was already gone, legally absorbed by my newly minted corporation. I looked at my wife and her brother. They were standing frozen in the middle of the grand marble rotunda, completely surrounded by strangers holding the ruins of their treacherous conspiracy in their hands. They had tried to push me into an early grave. They had tried to steal my legacy, throw me onto the street, and walk away laughing into the sunset. They thought they were the predators, and they thought I was the prey. "You should have checked the dashcam," I said, my voice low, calm, and utterly merciless. I turned my back on them and walked away, the sound of my heavy leather shoes echoing against the polished marble floor. I did not look back to see them panic. I did not look back to see them scramble for a way out that simply did not exist. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped back into the bright, piercing sunlight of the Atlanta morning. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for months was completely gone. My chest was clear. My mind was sharp. The net had closed perfectly around their throats, and I was finally truly free. The Friday morning sun broke over the Atlanta skyline with a fierce and blinding brilliance. It was the kind of morning that felt scrubbed entirely clean, completely stripped of the heavy humidity that usually clung to the southern streets. I drove my vehicle toward the downtown commercial district, navigating the familiar morning traffic with a completely unfamiliar sense of profound tranquility. For 25 years, this exact commute had been a grueling march of anxiety, a daily grind of immense pressure and unappreciated sacrifice. I used to grip the steering wheel with tense hands, calculating complex risk models and stressing over demanding client portfolios before I even reached the parking garage. Today, however, my hands rested lightly on the soft leather. My breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic. I was no longer a beast of burden pulling a heavy cart for a master who despised me. I was the dark storm gathering right on the horizon, absolutely ready to unleash devastation on the house of cards my former boss called a business. I pulled into the underground parking structure of the towering glass skyscraper that housed the commercial insurance agency. It was the very same building I had abruptly walked away from just days earlier. The security guards nodded at me, completely unaware of the tectonic shifts occurring in the corporate hierarchy above their heads. I took the private executive elevator up to the top floor. The quiet hum of the ascending carriage felt like a slow, deliberate countdown to absolute justice. When the polished steel doors slid smoothly open, I stepped out onto the plush, thick carpet of the executive reception area. The entire floor was eerily quiet, functioning on that hushed, pristine level of artificial wealth that Bradley loved to project to the world. He had always been obsessed with the superficial aesthetics of success, spending vast sums of company money on imported Italian marble floors, expensive modern art, and custom lighting fixtures, while completely ignoring the actual, grueling mathematical labor that kept the lights turned on. The main boardroom was situated at the very end of the corridor, boasting a magnificent panoramic view of the sprawling city. I walked through the heavy double doors and took in the scene before me. Bradley had clearly spared absolutely no expense for what he believed would be his ultimate moment of triumph. The massive polished walnut conference table was immaculate. A lavish, ridiculously expensive catered breakfast had been meticulously arranged across the center. There were silver trays piled high with fresh exotic fruits, imported European pastries, and smoked salmon. Crystal pitchers of freshly squeezed juices and insulated carafes of high-end coffee rested on pristine white linen napkins. It was a feast designed to overwhelm and flatter a billionaire. It was a pathetic, transparent display of desperation from an entitled boy who had nothing of actual substance to offer. I did not come to this room alone. Standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city with a stern, unreadable expression was Mr. Harrison. The billionaire logistics magnate wore a beautifully tailored charcoal gray suit. He emanated an aura of quiet, immovable power. We had arrived a full hour before the scheduled 9 o'clock meeting, utilizing the private entry codes I still possessed from my tenure. Mr. Harrison turned away from the window as I approached the table. We did not need to exchange a multitude of words. We had spent the last 48 hours finalizing the legal and financial transition of his massive commercial portfolio to my newly minted firm. The trust between us had been forged in the fire of my absolute honesty and his deep respect for authentic blue-collar grit. I walked over to the head of the conference table, the seat traditionally reserved for the chief executive of the agency. I pulled the heavy leather chair back and sat down. I poured myself a single cup of black coffee from the silver carafe, ignoring the lavish display of food entirely. I took a slow sip, feeling the bitter dark liquid slide down my throat. Mr. Harrison took the seat immediately to my right, folding his hands and resting them calmly on the polished wood. We sat in perfect absolute silence, waiting for the architect of his own destruction to arrive. Shortly before 9 o'clock, the distinct sounds of arrogant confidence began to echo down the carpeted hallway. I could hear Bradley's voice booming with loud, unearned bravado. He was speaking to his sycophantic junior partners, bragging loudly about the brilliant negotiation strategy he was about to deploy. I could hear the sharp, rhythmic clicking of his expensive Italian leather shoes hitting the marble sections of the floor. He was strutting. He was practically vibrating with the thrilling anticipation of securing the massive contract, stealing my legacy, and cementing his status as a corporate titan. He genuinely believed that the proprietary risk models he had stolen from my home computer via Cynthia's spyware were his golden ticket to unmitigated glory. He had absolutely no idea that those stolen files were rigged with digital tracking beacons, and he had no idea that his entire financial world had been frozen by federal injunctions just hours prior. The heavy boardroom doors swung open with a dramatic flourish. Bradley strode into the room wearing a custom navy suit and a blindingly white smile. He was holding a thick, leather-bound presentation folder, undoubtedly containing the plagiarized, critically flawed version of my risk algorithms. His junior assistants hovered nervously in the doorway behind him, carrying additional promotional materials. Bradley opened his mouth, ready to deliver a slick, practiced greeting to his billionaire client. But the words died instantly in his throat. His eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto me. The transformation of his face was an absolute masterpiece of human cognitive dissonance. The blinding, confident smile completely evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, sickening shock. He stopped dead in his tracks. His expensive leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the hardwood border of the room. He stared at me sitting comfortably at the head of his conference table, casually holding a mug of black coffee. He looked at Mr. Harrison sitting calmly by my side. Bradley's brain simply could not process the visual information. I was supposed to be a sick, broken, defeated old man, exiled from my own home, completely stripped of my wealth by a treacherous wife and a corrupt lawyer. I was supposed to be irrelevant. Yet here I was, occupying his throne, flanked by his most vital client. Jerome Bradley stammered, his voice cracking, losing an entire octave of its usual booming authority. "What are you doing here? You resigned. You do not work for this agency anymore. You are trespassing." I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my voice. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the profound, agonizing silence that stretched across the opulent boardroom. I lowered the ceramic mug to the table, letting the quiet clink echo in the tense air. I looked directly into his wide, panicked eyes. "I am not here as your employee, Bradley," I said, my voice resonating with a deep, smooth, and chilling calm. "I am here as a guest of Mr. Harrison." Bradley swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. A faint sheen of sweat began to materialize on his forehead. He desperately tried to regain control of the narrative, clutching his leather-bound folder tightly to his chest, like a physical shield. He forced a weak, trembling smile and turned his attention toward the billionaire, attempting to completely ignore my presence. Mr. Harrison Bradley began, his voice shaking with a pathetic, manufactured enthusiasm. "I apologize for this highly irregular interruption. Jerome has been dealing with some severe personal and mental health issues lately, which is why he abruptly left our firm. But I assure you, our agency is fully prepared to move forward. I have personally overseen the development of your new 10-year commercial risk policy. I have completely revolutionized the predictive modeling to save your logistics fleet millions of dollars." Bradley took a step forward, extending his arms, and placed the heavy leather folder directly onto the polished walnut table. He slid it across the smooth surface toward Mr. Harrison. It was a desperate, foolish gamble. He was trying to sell stolen, manipulated goods right in front of the man who had actually built them. Mr. Harrison did not reach for the folder. He did not even look at it. He kept his sharp, discerning eyes locked entirely on Bradley. The billionaire slowly stood up from his leather chair. The sheer, imposing physical presence of the older man completely dwarfed Bradley's superficial bravado. Mr. Harrison reached out with a large, weathered hand and picked up the leather folder. He held it for a brief, agonizing moment, feeling the weight of the plagiarized lies contained within its pages. Then, with a sudden, forceful, and utterly dismissive motion, Mr. Harrison threw the folder directly onto the floor. The heavy binder hit the imported Italian marble with a loud, violent smack. The pages burst open, scattering the stolen, compromised algorithms across the ground, right at Bradley's feet. The junior assistant standing in the doorway gasped, taking synchronized steps backward, realizing they were witnessing a corporate execution. Bradley flinched, his eyes darting frantically from the scattered papers on the floor to the cold, unyielding face of the billionaire. "Did you really think I was an absolute fool, Bradley?" Mr. Harrison asked, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous register that filled the entire room with menace. "Did you genuinely believe you could steal a man's life work, manipulate the financial back end to bury hidden administrative fees to line your own greedy pockets, and then present it to me as your own brilliant innovation?" Bradley's face drained of all remaining color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a live landmine and heard the internal mechanism click. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusations, to spin another web of lies, but no sound emerged. His breathing became rapid and shallow. "I know exactly what you did." Mr. Harrison continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to the trembling agency owner. "Jerome provided me with the irrefutable digital tracking logs. I have seen the exact timestamps of your corporate espionage. I have seen the hidden margins you tried to skim off my operational budget. You are nothing but a common, pathetic thief wearing your father's expensive suits. Let me make this incredibly clear to you, boy. I follow the man who builds the actual value not the parasite who tries to steal it. Mr. Harrison turned his back on Bradley completely, an ultimate gesture of profound disrespect. He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy gold pen. I calmly opened my own leather briefcase resting on the table and pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents representing my newly minted corporate entity. I laid the massive multi-million-dollar exclusive logistics contract on the polished walnut surface. Bradley watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Mr. Harrison leaned over the table and signed his name with large, sweeping, authoritative strokes. With every scratch of the gold pen, the lifeblood of Bradley's agency was entirely drained away. The massive revenue stream that kept his lights on, paid his exorbitant salary, and funded his luxurious lifestyle was officially gone. It belonged to me now. Bradley let out a desperate, strangled sound. "Mr. Harrison, please, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "We have a long-standing relationship. If you pull this account, my agency cannot survive the fiscal quarter. We will be bankrupt." I sat quietly watching the absolute destruction of his ego. But the true devastating reality had not even fully hit him yet. He did not know that bankruptcy was not a future problem. He did not know that his total ruin had already arrived. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open once again. Bradley's chief financial officer, a frantic, red-faced man holding a tablet, rushed into the room, completely ignoring the thick tension. He ran directly up to Bradley, grabbing his arm with trembling hands. Bradley, the financial officer, gasped, sweat pouring down his face. "The banks. Everything is completely frozen. Our corporate operating accounts, the payroll reserves, the domestic transfers. The federal marshals just served us with an emergency injunction. We have absolutely zero liquidity. We cannot even make the employee payroll by 5 o'clock this evening. The entire firm is locked down." The physical reaction was immediate and incredibly satisfying to witness. The realization hit Bradley like a massive, invisible freight train. He staggered backward, his knees visibly buckling under the sudden, crushing weight of total annihilation. His stolen account was gone. His reputation was permanently destroyed with the most powerful man in the city. His bank accounts were frozen by a federal judge. His employees were not going to get paid. He was looking at a massive civil lawsuit and severe criminal indictments for wire fraud and corporate espionage. The empire he thought he had cleverly secured by seducing my wife and plotting my demise had completely collapsed around his ears in less than 10 minutes. He fell back against the wall, clutching his chest, his breathing turning into rapid, hysterical hyperventilation. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a manic, unadulterated terror. He finally understood the sheer terrifying magnitude of the wolf he had decided to provoke. I did not offer him a single word of explanation. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice in triumph. Real power does not require loud declarations or dramatic speeches. Real power is absolute quiet and profoundly final. I calmly closed my leather briefcase, securing the brass latches with a solid, definitive snap. I picked up my mug and took one final satisfying sip of the black coffee. I placed the ceramic cup down gently on the pristine white linen napkin. I stood up from the head of the conference table, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit. Mr. Harrison nodded at me, a silent mutual acknowledgement of a battle flawlessly executed. I turned and walked slowly toward the boardroom doors. I stepped right over the scattered, plagiarized pages of his stolen contract resting on the marble floor. As I walked out into the carpeted hallway, the sound of Bradley's panicked, screaming hysteria echoed behind me, bouncing off the expensive artwork and the imported glass walls of his ruined agency. I did not look back. I stepped into the private executive elevator, the doors sliding smoothly shut, cutting off the noise entirely. I rode the carriage down to the ground floor, carrying my new empire in my hands, leaving the ashes of their treachery far behind me. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 402 looked like the entrance to an impenetrable vault. I stood in the polished corridor of the family court building, rolling my shoulders back to ease the tension beneath my charcoal-tailored suit. 3 entire weeks had passed since the morning I walked out of my own home with a single leather suitcase. 21 days since my treacherous wife and her parasitic brother smiled at my supposed defeat from the living room window. In that short span of time, a profound physical miracle had taken place within my body. The agonizing tightness in my chest that had plagued me for months was completely gone. The dizzy spells that used to blur my vision were a thing of the past. Without Cynthia brewing my morning coffee with lethal, undetectable stimulants, my blood pressure had returned to a perfectly healthy baseline. I was a 52-year-old African-American man who had literally reclaimed his own lifeblood. Today, I was here to reclaim my kingdom. I walked into the designated courtroom with my attorney, Thomas Harrington. We took our seats at the heavy wooden table reserved for the respondent. The room smelled of floor wax and old paper, carrying that distinct, heavy atmosphere of judicial authority. We did not speak, we did not need to. The legal trap had been set with absolute meticulous precision over the past 3 weeks, and today was the day the steel jaws would finally snap shut. 10 minutes later, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Cynthia and Greg walked down the center aisle, presenting the absolute picture of arrogant confidence. Greg wore a sharp, expensive gray suit, carrying his leather briefcase with that familiar, unearned swagger. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his offshore accounts had been frozen by federal mandate. Cynthia walked closely behind him, playing her role to absolute perfection. She wore a simple, conservative, light blue dress. Her hair was tied back, and she clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand. She kept her head bowed, portraying herself to the court staff as a terrified, fragile victim of an unstable husband. They sat down at the petitioner table just a few feet away from us. Greg leaned over and whispered something into Cynthia's ear. She nodded, letting out a long, theatrical sigh. I watched them from the corner of my eye. They were so incredibly comfortable in their web of lies. They truly believed they were walking into a standard routine divorce hearing, where they would use Greg's legal manipulation to steal my house, drain my savings, and secure a lifetime of alimony. They thought I was a broken, exhausted old man who had only shown up to quietly surrender. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and we all stood up. Judge Reynolds took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a veteran magistrate with a stern-lined face and a reputation for having absolutely zero patience for courtroom theatrics. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the thick files resting on his desk. Greg stood up almost immediately, buttoning his suit jacket. He launched into his opening statement, and it was a masterpiece of disgusting fiction. Greg spoke with a smooth, authoritative tone, telling the judge about my supposed sudden mental breakdown. He referenced the fabricated police incident at our home, claiming I had become violent and unpredictable after losing my corporate job. He spoke about Cynthia's immense emotional suffering, describing how she had given 15 years of her life to a man who had suddenly transformed into a monster. Therefore, Your Honor. Greg concluded, his voice ringing with fake sympathy, we are requesting an expedited dissolution of this marriage. Due to the severe emotional distress inflicted upon my client and her complete lack of independent income, we are demanding sole ownership of the primary residence, full access to the joint financial accounts, and maximum permanent alimony. We simply want to ensure this terrified woman can rebuild her life in peace. Greg sat down, adjusting his tie, looking incredibly pleased with his performance. Cynthia dabbed her dry eyes with her tissue. Judge Reynolds looked over at our table. "Counselor," the judge said, addressing Thomas, "does your client have a response to these demands?" Thomas Harrington stood up slowly. He did not look at Greg. He did not look at Cynthia. He looked directly at the judge with a calm, dangerous respect. "We do, Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice smooth and deadly. "We will not be arguing with opposing counsel today. We will not be debating asset division or discussing lifetime alimony. Instead, we wish to submit a single piece of evidence into the official court record. We believe this evidence will entirely clarify the nature of this marriage and immediately resolve all financial disputes." Greg let out an arrogant scoff, leaning back in his chair. "Your Honor, any fabricated evidence they have cannot override my client's legal right to her marital assets. This is simply a stalling tactic." Judge Reynolds held up his hand, silencing Greg instantly. "I will allow the evidence, Counselor," the judge said, looking at Thomas. "Proceed." Thomas walked over to the court clerk and handed over a small encrypted flash drive. He requested that the audio file be played over the courtroom speakers. The clerk plugged the drive into the system and pressed a button. For a brief second, there was only the soft crackle of static. And then Cynthia's voice echoed through the large, quiet courtroom. It was not the trembling, weak voice of a victim. It was a breathless, intimate giggle recorded directly from the hidden dual-facing dash cam inside the luxury SUV I had purchased for her. I saw Greg's smug smile freeze completely on his face. Cynthia's head jerked up, her blue eyes widening in absolute confusion. Then Bradley's voice came through the speakers, deep and arrogant. "Did you slip him those heart rate spikes I got you?" The air in the courtroom instantly dropped 10 degrees. The bailiff standing near the door stopped moving. The court reporter's hands hovered silently over her keyboard. Cynthia's recorded voice filled the room again, dripping with a cold, calculating malice. "Yes. His blood pressure is through the roof. He is complaining about agonizing chest pain every single morning before he leaves for the office. He will either have a fatal stroke very soon, or the crushing stress of his daily routine will force him to quit to save his own life." I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the wooden table. I watched Cynthia's face drain of all color. She looked exactly like a ghost. Her jaw hung open, but absolutely no sound escaped her throat. She stared at the wall-mounted speakers as if they were a firing squad. The audio recording continued without mercy. It played Bradley laughing about stealing my unvested shares. It played Cynthia happily detailing her plan to file for divorce claim. Emotional distress, take half my cash, keep the house, and leave me completely destitute. Once he throws in the towel, I file immediately. Cynthia's voice echoed in the silent room. We cleaned the old man out completely. The audio track ended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Nobody took a single breath. I looked at Greg. The slick, confident lawyer was entirely gone. He was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were pure white, his eyes darting frantically around the room. In that exact moment, he realized he was standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. Judge Reynolds slowly took off his glasses. He looked down at his desk, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When he looked up, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He stared at Cynthia with an expression of profound disgust, looking at her as if she were a roach crawling across his courtroom floor. Cynthia tried to speak. She stood up, her hands shaking violently, dropping her crumpled tissue to the floor. "Your Honor," she stammered, her voice breaking into a pathetic squeak. "That is fake. That is illegally obtained evidence. I never said those things. He is trying to frame me." Judge Reynolds slammed his wooden gavel down with the force of a gunshot. "Sit down and remain entirely silent," the judge roared, his voice echoing with terrifying authority. "Do not speak another word in my courtroom unless you wish to be held in immediate contempt." Cynthia collapsed back into her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Thomas Harrington remained standing, perfectly calm. "Your Honor," Thomas said smoothly, "along with that audio, we have submitted a comprehensive digital data packet to the clerk. It includes time-stamped video evidence of the marital infidelity. Furthermore, it includes certified forensic accounting records proving that opposing counsel Gregory actively forged notary seals to illegally transfer my client's assets into offshore accounts." Greg jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward. "That is a lie," he shouted, his panic completely overriding his professional facade. "You cannot prove that. I am a licensed attorney. You have no jurisdiction to present that here." "Actually," Gregory Thomas replied, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction, "the federal authorities already have full jurisdiction. The injunctions were signed 48 hours ago. Your offshore accounts are currently frozen, and the state bar has already been notified of your impending indictment." As if perfectly timed to Thomas's words, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung wide open. Two large county sheriff deputies in full uniform walked in, followed closely by a plainclothes detective. They marched straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked entirely on Greg. Judge Reynolds pointed a stern finger toward the petitioner table. "Bailiff, secure that man," the judge ordered. Greg backed away, bumping into the wooden partition behind him. He looked at Cynthia, silently begging for help, but she was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the floor. The deputies moved swiftly, grabbing Greg by both arms and twisting them firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent courtroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. "You cannot do this," Greg yelled, his voice cracking as they locked the steel around his wrists. "I am a lawyer. I demand a phone call. Cynthia, tell them. Tell them it was all Bradley." The officers ignored his frantic screaming, forcing the disgraced lawyer down the aisle and out through the double doors. The heavy wood swung shut, cutting off his pathetic shouting. The architect of my financial sabotage was gone, stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and the legal license I had paid for. Judge Reynolds turned his furious gaze back to the petitioner table, where Cynthia sat completely alone. She was shrinking into her chair, looking incredibly small and sick. "Mrs. Stovall," Judge Reynolds said, his voice resonating with deep judicial wrath, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed a marital betrayal so calculated, so greedy, and so fundamentally evil. You conspired to poison your husband. You conspired to steal his life's work. You attempted to manipulate this court to finalize your robbery." The judge picked up his pen, holding it over the official divorce decree. "I am granting the dissolution of this marriage immediately," Judge Reynolds declared, his words falling like heavy anvils. "Due to egregious marital fault and documented attempted physical harm, you are stripped of any and all claims to the marital estate. You will receive absolutely no alimony. You forfeit all rights to the primary residence, the savings accounts, and the investment portfolios. Furthermore, I am forwarding these transcripts directly to the district attorney for immediate criminal review regarding conspiracy to commit murder. You will walk out of this courtroom with absolutely nothing. We are adjourned." The judge slammed his gavel one final time, stood up, and walked out of the room. The court clerk began gathering the files. Thomas Harrington snapped his briefcase shut, giving me a single respectful nod. The war was officially over. I had won. I had protected my empire, secured my wealth, and watched the people who tried to bury me face their own ultimate destruction. I stood up from the heavy oak table, buttoning my suit jacket. I felt incredibly light. I felt immensely powerful. I turned and began to walk down the center aisle toward the exit. As I passed the petitioner table, I heard a desperate rustling sound. Cynthia threw herself out of her chair, landing hard on her knees on the wooden floor right in my path. Her designer dress crumpled around her. The fake tears were completely gone, replaced by genuine, ugly, heaving sobs. Her face was flushed red and streaked with ruined makeup. She reached out with shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my trousers. "Jerome, please," she sobbed, her voice a pathetic, broken wail. "Please do not do this to me. I have nothing left. Bradley is ruined. Greg is going to prison. I have no money. I have nowhere to go. Please, I am so sorry. It was a mistake. I love you. Please give me another chance. Do not leave me like this." I stopped walking. I looked down at the woman who had shared my bed for 15 years. I looked at the woman who had watched me swallow poison every morning with a smile on her face. I saw the absolute terror in her eyes, the horrifying realization that she was facing federal prison and absolute poverty. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute indifference. I gently stepped back, moving my leg out of her reach. I did not speak a single word to her. I did not curse her or insult her. She was no longer a human being to me. She was just a shadow, a ghost of a past life that I had entirely conquered. I walked right around her sobbing form and continued down the aisle. I pushed open the heavy double doors, leaving her desperate crying echoing against the wood-paneled walls of the empty courtroom. I walked down the marble corridor and stepped into the elevator, riding it down to the ground floor. As I walked out the front doors of the courthouse, the warm Atlanta sun washed over my face. I took a deep, filling breath of the clean, fresh air of a free man ready to build his new empire. Everyone, if my story brought you a little piece of motivation, remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. Your support means the absolute world to me. The morning sun rises over the Atlanta skyline, casting a brilliant golden glow across the sprawling metropolis. I stand on the expansive glass balcony of my newly established corporate headquarters, holding a steaming mug of freshly brewed coffee. I take a long, slow sip, letting the rich, dark flavor wash over my tongue. For the first time in what feels like an absolute eternity, I do not have to worry about what might be hiding inside the cup. The coffee is just coffee. It is not a weapon. It is not a silent daily dose of poison administered by the woman who swore to love and protect me. As I look out over the towering skyscrapers and the endless streams of morning traffic far below, a profound sense of absolute peace settles deep into my bones. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that family courtroom, leaving the shattered remains of my treacherous past completely behind me. The physical transformation I have experienced over these past 6 months is nothing short of miraculous. When I first discovered the horrifying truth about Cynthia and Bradley, I was a man physically deteriorating before my own eyes. My blood pressure had been sky high. My chest constantly ached with a heavy, suffocating pressure, and my vision would frequently blur with sudden, terrifying dizzy spells. I truly believed the grueling stress of my 25-year career was finally taking its ultimate toll on my aging body. But the moment I left that house and stopped consuming the lethal stimulants Cynthia had been secretly feeding me, my body immediately began to heal. Today, at 52 years old, I feel stronger, sharper, and more vibrant than I have felt in over a decade. I wake up every single morning with a clear mind and a steady heart. The heavy invisible chain that had been dragging me down into an early grave has been permanently shattered. I am a free man, and I have reclaimed the vital energy of my own existence. I did not keep the sprawling suburban house. Even though the judge had rightfully awarded me full ownership of the property, I had absolutely no desire to live inside those walls ever again. The custom brickwork, the manicured lawns, the expensive mahogany dining table where my wife and her parasitic brother had tried to steal my life's work, it all felt entirely tainted. A home is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of unconditional safety and rest. That house had become a crime scene, a monument to greed and deception, so I put it on the market immediately. I sold it to a young, hard-working couple who were thrilled to start their own family there. I took the massive equity from that sale and purchased a beautiful, highly secure luxury condominium right in the heart of the city, just a few blocks away from my new corporate office. My new home is quiet. It is pristine. The security is absolute, and the peace of mind it provides is truly priceless. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every item inside my new sanctuary was chosen by me, for me. There are no ghosts hiding in the shadows. There are no whispers of betrayal in the hallways. While my life has expanded into a beautiful new chapter of prosperity and freedom, the people who conspired to destroy me have met a very different, entirely deserved fate. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales, and the absolute destruction of their arrogant empire has been a quiet, poetic justice to witness. Cynthia, the woman who believed she could manipulate the legal system, murder her husband, and walk away as a wealthy, carefree widow, has been violently introduced to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. Stripped of all marital assets and completely denied any form of alimony by the family court judge, she found herself instantly destitute. The luxurious lifestyle she had grown so incredibly accustomed to, the designer dresses, the expensive salon visits, the premium sports cars, evaporated overnight. With the looming threat of a criminal investigation hanging heavily over her head, she quickly became a social pariah. The wealthy suburban friends she used to entertain completely turned their backs on her. Today, Cynthia works the grueling night shift at a cheap 24-hour roadside diner on the outskirts of the city. She spends her evenings wiping down greasy tables, serving exhausted truck drivers, and counting meager tips just to afford a tiny, run-down apartment. The soft, uncalloused hands she once used to lovingly hand me poisoned coffee are now rough-burned and constantly smelling of cheap frying oil. She is drowning under a mountain of mounting legal debts, completely trapped in a miserable existence of her own making. Every single night, as she carries heavy trays of food on her aching feet, she has to live with the agonizing realization that she threw away a life of absolute luxury because her greed simply could not be satisfied. Her brother Greg is faring even worse. The arrogant, slick-talking attorney who thought he could outsmart a seasoned corporate veteran is currently sitting in a federal holding facility. The forensic accounting evidence my legal team handed over to the authorities was entirely bulletproof. The State Bar Association officially stripped him of his license to practice law within weeks of the courthouse confrontation. He was publicly disbarred, disgraced in front of his peers, and formally indicted on multiple felony charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and the forgery of official notary seals. He is looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The expensive tailored suits I used to buy for him have been permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. And then there is Bradley, the entitled, arrogant boy who thought he could effortlessly steal my customized intellectual property and secure his father's failing legacy. The corporate sabotage injunctions we filed absolutely paralyzed his commercial insurance agency. When Mr. Harrison, the billionaire logistics magnate, publicly severed all ties with Bradley's firm and signed a massive exclusive contract with my new company, the rest of Bradley's clientele immediately panicked. Trust is the absolute currency of the commercial insurance industry. Once the word leaked that Bradley was under federal investigation for corporate espionage and massive data theft, his clients fled his agency like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Within 2 short months, his company officially filed for bankruptcy. The lavish boardroom where he had tried to present my plagiarized blueprints to Mr. Harrison was auctioned off piece by piece to pay his outstanding creditors. Bradley himself is currently facing severe federal indictments for intellectual property theft and corporate fraud. He is completely ruined financially and professionally. The empire he tried to steal has crumbled into dust, and he will spend the rest of his life branded as a desperate, incompetent thief. I often stand on this balcony, watching the city move below me, and I reflect on the profound, grueling journey that brought me to this exact moment. I am a man who spent his entire life playing by the rules. I believed in the sanctity of hard work. I believed in providing for my family, in lifting up those around me, and in carrying the heavy burdens of responsibility without a single complaint. But this harrowing ordeal has taught me a lesson that I will carry in my heart for the rest of my days. My brothers and sisters listening to this, I want you to hear me very clearly. The hard, uncomfortable truth of life is that blood and vows do not always guarantee loyalty. You can spend decades sacrificing your entire life for your family. You can bleed for your job. You can pour every ounce of your energy, your wealth, and your youth into building a beautiful life for the people you love. You can give them the very clothes on their backs and the food on their tables. But sometimes the people closest to you, the people sleeping in your own bed, will look at everything you have given them and simply decide that they want more. They will look at your sacrifices and see only weakness. They will mistake your quiet generosity for foolishness. When your gut tells you that something is wrong, you absolutely must listen to it. The human spirit possesses an incredible innate radar for deception. If the coffee tastes wrong, if the smiles seem forced, if the numbers do not add up, do not ignore those quiet alarms. Do not let your love blind you to the reality of the predators standing right in front of your face. And when the unthinkable finally happens, when you uncover the ultimate betrayal, when they try to steal your legacy, your wealth, and your very life, you do not break down and cry. You do not scream, and you do not beg them for explanations. Explanations from a traitor are nothing but manipulated lies designed to confuse you. Instead, you stay perfectly quiet. You mask your fury. You let them believe that they are winning. You let them bask in their false sense of victory while you retreat into the shadows. You sharpen your sword in absolute silence. You gather your evidence, you secure your assets, and you build an impenetrable fortress around your future. And when the perfect moment arrives, you strike back with everything you have. You strike back with a cold, calculated, and relentless force that completely dismantles their world. Justice is not something that is simply handed to you by the universe. Justice is something you must ruthlessly manufacture with your own 2 hands. I survived the absolute worst betrayal a man can experience, and I did not just survive it, I conquered it. I turned their malicious poison into my ultimate power. I built a new empire from the ashes of their deceit. If this story resonated with your spirit, if you understand the deep, profound pain of betrayal and the glorious, righteous triumph of absolute justice, please hit that like button to bring a little sunshine to a man who weathered the ultimate storm and came out significantly stronger. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next real-life stories I have to share. And please tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this video from, and what time is it there right now? It truly brings immense joy to my heart to know exactly which corner of the country or the world is listening to my voice today. Stay incredibly strong, trust your instincts, stay perpetually vigilant, and God bless. I will see you all in the next story.